Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. And let's bijins. I'm a receptionist at a popular hotel chain in the US. For the better part of a year, I'd been working overnights. This night, I was doing my usual shift of 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was boring outside, so I wasn't expecting any walk-ins, and on the schedule, it didn't show any bookings starting tonight. On nights like these, my job is to just stay awake and take phone calls or help current customers with any room services or checkouts. We had a coffee machine in the hotel lobby, so I had a cup of coffee next to me as I tried to stay awake. Even having been on overnights for a while now, I still had trouble with getting tired on my shifts. The rain outside made me even more tired as well. At around 1 a.m., a phone call came in. I answered, but before I could even speak, a man very quickly asked if we were still accepting walk-ins. Their voice was very muffled, though, and there was a background sound that was extremely loud. "Yeah, we have rooms available for walk-in tonight," I said. They responded, but I couldn't make out what exactly they were saying. As I asked if they could repeat themselves, I looked up from the desk and saw a small light glowing outside. It was from a phone, as someone was holding it up to their ear, standing right up against the front window in the pouring rain. Knowing this had to be whoever I was talking to, I was about to go get them, but something about this made me feel uneasy. I decided to pretend like I hadn't seen them. A moment later, they ended the phone call. I saw the light turn off outside, and the outline of the man moving toward the entrance doors. The doors opened, and the man walked through the hotel lobby, dragging water across the floor with him. He came up to the counter and bluntly asked for a room. He was fully soaked through and had water dripping from his hair, yet his face showed nothing but exhaustion. I don't know if I'd ever seen someone looking so sleep-deprived. I said okay and found him a room, then asked him how he'd like to pay for it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a debit card, then handed it to me. I swiped it, but it was declined. I looked up at him, only to see he was now staring at me. It didn't go through. Do you have another card to try?" The man didn't respond, holding his stare and not moving, aside from a few rapid blinks. As the seconds kept on without any reaction, I grew more and more uneasy. I looked down and put the card back on the desk, sliding it over to him. He didn't even look at it, though. He turned and started walking away and toward the hallway with the rooms. By now, I knew something really wasn't right. I quickly pressed the button that calls for the police, then went out to the hallway the man was in. I found him standing next to the door of one of the rooms. He started pounding on it, yelling in a harsh voice for them to open the door. I tried telling the man to stop, but I didn't want to get too close, not knowing if he was in a dangerous state. He then pulled a knife from his pocket and started trying to pry the door open. I yelled at him to stop and that the police were already on their way. The man stopped for a second, then shot an awful glance at me. He faced me and screamed at me to open the door for him. As he started walking down the hallway, I was terrified. I just ran right out of the hotel and into the parking lot. Through the window, I could see him go back to the same door and continue pounding on it. The police were quick to show up, making it inside before the man could get into the room. Somehow, they convinced him to drop the knife and locked him up in their car. The person that was in the room came out as well. It was a kind young lady who was visibly scared and horrified. It turned out the man was an ex of hers that she hadn't seen or talked to in over 10 years. How he got the information on where she was staying, and even what room she was in, nobody seemed to know. They aren't even sure how long he'd been stalking her for, which is really disturbing. What he would have done had he gotten in, though, is likely far more disturbing even than that. This story is really bizarre as all hell. I still remember it clear as daylight. It was probably May 1st, 2005 in my hometown of bumfuck nowhere, Maine. I was 4 years old, with my father walking around the May Day festival. It's a small festival put on every year at the local high school with a bounce house, baked goods, face painting, fire safety teachings, and one lone paramedic in case anything were to transpire. Maybe a couple of food vendors here and there as well. On this specific year, they had this random clown doing balloon animals for all the kids. I asked my father, "Will you go get me one?" He looked over at the clown smiling, and then down at me. "Why don't you wait here for a moment? Let's grab some water, and we can go together," he said, giving me a happy medium. I smiled up at him, but also being 4 and very naive and stubborn, I did not listen. I marched my tiny legs right over to the tall man, probably 5 feet 11 inches, had overalls with paint splatter all over them, a red styrofoam nose, white base, and a big red smile with blue grease paints. Long, scraggly hair that only came down from the side of his head, leaving a bald donut on top. I thought that's how all clowns looked, honestly. He had white gloves stained in brown and deep mahogany covers. I thought that was paint too, but who fucking knows at this stage? He was making a giraffe for the little boy before me. I was too shy to interrupt, just kind of mesmerized by what he was doing. When he was done, I stepped forward very shyly and stuttered out a weak, "Excuse me, sir." His head whipped over to me. His eyes stared through my soul. I was about to ask him for a sword or something, but he reached down so quick it caught me by surprise. He grabbed my left wrist and yanked it up to him, then sank his teeth into my forearm. I started shrieking within a millisecond. The guy let go of me and ran off down the back exits of the high school. I had a giant bite mark on my arm, and my father ran to my side immediately. He looked up and saw the clown taking off down the road. He was mad, but he picked me up and ran me over to the paramedics' tent. The cops were called, and the people surrounding us at the tent tried to view my arm. In a small town like that, everyone has to be involved in something like this. This was pre-high-quality cell phone days, so no one was filming this or anything. Plenty of my hometown residents saw it though, and all were horrified by what they'd seen. Everyone who saw had to give a statement to the cops, including me and my father. After all these years, my father told me the event coordinators came up to him after my mom had picked me up. They told him they'd never hired a clown for entertainment, nor did the cops ever find the man. They told my dad it was probably some drugged-up junkie having a bad trip and taking it out on me. My hometown does have one of the worst drug epidemics in the state, so they wouldn't exactly surprise me. Irony of the whole story, though, my mom sent me to circus school when I was in middle school, and she also started an animal-free circus as well, made entirely of puppets. I guess you could say I have my own clown DNA. My uncle really hates getting letters. It's not just letters though, it's anything. Things like get well soon cards, Happy New Year's cards. He just always told my family not to bother sending him anything. I never really understood that, but I also hated writing and sending cards. I mean, it's a pain in the ass, isn't it? I was, however, a little curious as to why he was so vehemently opposed to them. I mean, writing them is one thing, but receiving them really isn't all that hard. It doesn't take much effort to just get a card out of your postbox. I decided to ask him what the issue was. I asked him very outright, and in response, the old dude just stared at me a little cockeyed and smiled while lighting a cigarette. He then said, "All right, I'll let you hear a story of mine. A long time ago, he used to work in the Philippines, and between me and him, he was having a really hard time with money. He'd made some bad decisions when he was about my age, and made some bad friends too. A guy he used to hang out with suggested that he check out an opportunity in the Philippines, and he thought, why not? My immediate question to my uncle was, what kind of job? It wasn't anything shady. It was just a delivery job. Well, I mean, it wasn't an official delivery job per se. I remember I had to drop off these pitch black letter envelopes to certain places I was told to go to. I would go to a location, and at that location, I would be handed a set of car keys by some guy dressed in a black suit. And from there, I was asked to drive to deliver whatever they'd handed to me, which usually was one of those black envelopes. You know the type, right? Bubble lined for sending fragile goods. It was always sealed. So after I delivered the envelope, I would drive the car back to the place I'd parked my vehicle and give the car keys back to the guy. At that point, I'd get paid. Let me tell you, for how simple the work was, I got paid more than I could imagine. It was amazing. One thing stood out to me though. Whenever I received the envelope I was supposed to deliver, the guy in black that I got it from was always a different guy every time. Each one of those guys told me to never open it. Well, did you open it? I asked. He left me hanging for a moment or two, and then he went into an experience he had on his delivery job. I want to save you the back and forth of conversation we had, so I'll do my best to sum up what happened. Basically, whenever my uncle was stuck in traffic, he would glance at that envelope that he kept on the passenger seat beside him. It was really hard for him to just ignore it. I mean, I understand, because as a kid, if I was ever told not to do something, the very first thing I would want to do was the thing I wasn't supposed to do. His curiosity grew every time he made a drop-off, until one afternoon he gave in to that curiosity. He was stuck in traffic and quite bored, and he thought that no one would ever know if he took a quick peek inside. I mean, what's the worst that could happen, right? My uncle opened the envelope and looked inside. Inside, to his surprise, there was another envelope. That's strange, he thought. Why go to the effort of putting an envelope inside a bigger envelope? He opened the smaller one and didn't see a letter or message inside. Just as he was thinking, man, they got me driving around here for no reason, with packages full of air, he suddenly fell incredibly ill. As he was stuck in traffic, he opened his door to get some air. He said there was a terrible smell in the car. He ended up stumbling out of it and landing face down on the road. He began to cough and retch, and said he was foaming at the mouth, even started vomiting blood. He then lost consciousness. Shortly after, he woke up to find himself in bed. Little did he know there was someone from this organization watching him at all times. That person had reported what he'd done. My uncle was treated by a doctor, which shall we say wasn't exactly legitimate. He was then driven to the airport and abandoned. He eventually managed to get together enough funds by calling a bunch of our relatives. He was then able to leave and return to Japan. I asked him about what he thought had happened to him. He said he thought he was involved in some kind of chemical warfare between rival gangs. That isn't confirmed, obviously, but it's just what he thinks given the nature of the work he'd been doing. I'm inclined to believe him. He said he never knew what was in the contents of those packages and envelopes he was carrying, and then he kind of looked away from me, as if he had been contemplating. Maybe not knowing the contents of those envelopes and packages was for the best. He stubbed his cigarette out and said, "That's why I hate letters and cards," and we never spoke of it again. This happened back in October of 2016, at the very height of the killer clown craze that was going on back then. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was just a bunch of teenagers looking for a quick laugh by frightening others. I lived alone in a 2-story house. There's about a 3-mile walk between the neighboring houses. It's all separated by tall grass and forest. This detail will be important later on. Halloween night eventually came around, and I was watching Friday the 13th in the living room. The front of the house has a large window overlooking the lawn. I remember it was about 10:55 when Miss Voorhees was getting her head chopped off in the film. That's when I heard a small but very noticeable knock at the window. It made me jump up a bit in surprise. What the hell? I went over to the window and pulled the curtains backward. All I could see outside was darkness. 10 minutes later, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a knock at the front door. Now, the front door had these long panels of blurred glass. I looked through and saw nothing but darkness. However, a red object was in the corner of my vision. Wondering what it could be, I changed my angle of view, and I kid you not, it was a fucking clown standing adjacent to my front door and staring right back at me. I jumped back in surprise as the clown fully pressed his face up against the glass. I saw the clown had a knife in his hand. I grabbed my cell phone to dial 911, and that's when he started pounding on the glass hard enough to eventually break it. I ran up the stairs, locked my bedroom door, and got ready to call the police. An incoming call came in from my closest neighbor. Now, the phone service in my area is pretty bad. The 2 bedrooms and the bathroom in my house are the only places you can get good service. I answered the phone, but I couldn't really make out what my neighbor was saying. His voice was coming in patchy and glitchy. He apparently was in a bad spot for phone service. He said something along the lines that someone had just broken into his house. The call then disconnected. I quickly dialed 911 and told them what was going on. As I was on the phone, I heard the shattering of glass from downstairs. The dispatcher informed me to stay locked in the room until the police arrived. I heard footsteps coming up my stairs, followed shortly by pounding on my bedroom door. That went on for what felt like hours until I heard police sirens outside. The clown then shouted in a creepy and strained voice, "Oh, you fucker. You just had to." A flurry of footsteps descended the stairs and fled from the back door. I came out of the room and met with the officers. I explained everything to them, including how I'd received an odd phone call from my neighbor as well. As I was talking to the officers, my neighbor actually came over, and what he told me shocked me. He said that when he'd called me before, he was actually trying to warn me that a clown had broken into his house and run off in the direction of mine. The good news is that the cops ended up catching this clown during their search of the backyard. They brought him around the front and placed him into one of the cruisers. They said they'd found 2 knives on him and a loaded Glock 17. The scariest thing about this encounter is how the clown managed to get to my house so quickly without a vehicle of his own. He left my neighbors at 11:03 and arrived at my house at 11:05. The next day, I got a bunch of texts from an unknown number saying that now I was going to die. Since the perpetrator had already been locked up at this time, I'm guessing he must have had an acquaintance that did that to my neighbor. It makes me wonder what they truly wanted that night. I guess I'll never know for sure, but one thing that is for sure is that I fucking hate clowns now. This happened when I was working in a convenience store near a cram school. I used to work late at night, and I was known as a bit of a senior there. I had more experience than all the university students who worked there part-time. It was a great place to work if I'm being honest. I have some really good memories of being there. This experience, though, tops the list of memories, and it's not exactly a fond memory either. It's definitely something I'll never forget, though. Our convenience store didn't get all that busy at nighttime, so me and the other staff members often found ourselves free on most of the nights. When we had this free time, we'd kind of just hang out in the back together, eat and read magazines. It was really great, actually. One night, while we were doing our usual thing of hanging out in the back, I was on shift with a junior, and I was checking the security cameras. I really liked this particular guy. He was nice, and we had a good back and forth. We used to have a lot of fun discussions about movies and stuff. Always just a great partner to have around. The monitor in the back room was split up into 4 sections. 2 parts of the screen showed the cash registers, and the other 2 parts of the screen showed portions of the aisles. When I looked at the screen, I saw there was a woman stood by the magazine rack. Nothing wrong with that, of course. Customers come in and out all the time, and often browse things for a moment. However, this was a bit different. Neither of us had heard the entrance chime when she came in. She had this long dark hair and looked very disheveled, for lack of a better term. My coworker noticed her as well and said, "Hey, I didn't hear the chime, did you?" To be honest, there had been occasions where the chime didn't ring at all in the past. So we carried on talking without giving it much thought. What we usually did was just come out of the back when the customer approached the register. After a while, though, the woman didn't appear to be moving at all. She was just standing there perfectly, still like a statue. She didn't even grab a magazine to browse. She was just kind of staring off into space. My coworker asked me if she was planning on shoplifting, perhaps. It hadn't occurred to me, but it could be a possibility. It was pretty odd that she hadn't moved at all. We had an idea. We were going to go out and check on her. We would go in a pincer movement coming from either side. Make it look like we were stalking the shelves or dusting them to ensure that she wasn't actually trying to steal something. We walked right up to the magazine rack, but when we arrived, she was nowhere to be seen. We headed back to the back room thinking, she must have left without buying anything. Oh well, whatever. When we got back to the staff room, though, I looked at the monitor again and was shocked to see the woman standing in the same spot at the magazine rack. Well, how the hell did she do that? Was the monitor malfunctioning or something? We spoke about it amongst ourselves and decided to go out there and check once again. We headed out in the same pinching movement as before toward the magazine rack. Once again, she was nowhere to be found. How was she doing this? We rushed back to the staff room. I, for one, was absolutely chilled by what was going on. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't explain what was happening here. We were quiet. The first thing my colleague did was check the monitor. He told me that, once again, the woman with the dark hair was gone. I was feeling relieved. I thought he must have been feeling the same. Something weird was definitely going on, though. I wanted to see the monitors for myself, so I leaned over my colleague's shoulder to get a closer look. "Don't move," he said. I listened to him in frozen place. He sounded scared. I stayed next to him, thinking, what the hell is going on? I was worried. Was he all right? Did something happen? I looked at the reflection on the monitor. Not the live feed, but the reflection on the glass. I could see our faces, but there was something else behind us as well. A figure that I immediately recognized. It was the woman we had seen earlier. I felt my back go completely stiff. We were frozen in place, watching that reflection for a minute straight. All of a sudden, she darted backwards and toward the left. We stayed there for another minute, too scared to move at all. I tried to calm myself down until I couldn't bear it anymore. I looked away and slowly turned around in fear, expecting to see her hiding somewhere behind us. But to my surprise, she was nowhere to be found. We both backed away from the monitors in silence. "Something's going on here," my colleague said, as if he wanted me to agree that he wasn't going mad. He looked at me with these pleading eyes. I looked away and said, "Yeah, I agree." By the time I looked back, he was completely fixated on the monitors again. I felt my heart sink in my chest. What the hell was going to happen next? I looked at the screen, and once again, the woman was back out by the magazine rack. Only this time, she was turned up and facing the camera. She smiled and slowly opened her mouth, and began to say something that I couldn't quite make out. I'm not exactly a lip reader here. Without saying anything, my colleague ran out the back door, leaving me alone in the store. As much as I also wanted to run out right behind him, I had a responsibility as the senior staff member. I spent the remainder of the shift stood out front by the register. I figured that if I didn't look at the monitors, then I could visibly observe whatever the woman was doing. But as far as I know, since I didn't check the monitors, that was the last time I saw that woman that night. I was pissed at my colleague for sure, but he apologized very sincerely, and I forgave him. It was the strangest and scariest experience I've ever had. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain what exactly happened that night. My name is Austin. I'm a 26-year-old man, and this story took place about a month ago. This occurred on a trip my fiancé and I were on. We had just moved down to Florida for a chance at some better opportunities, especially for myself from where I was living previously. My fiancé had to sacrifice a lot for this transition though, so to help ease the stress a bit, we decided to go on a weekend trip to Universal Orlando Resort and have a fun time together. We had planned out everything ahead of time. With the tickets being so much money, we opted to go for a cheaper hotel to bring the price down a bit. Turned out that was a big mistake. We arrived at the hotel the day before we were supposed to visit the resort. We could immediately see why it was so cheap. The sign said Quality Inn, but from the looks of it, it was previously a rundown hotel some company had bought and slapped their own name on the sign. The room was nothing special at all. In fact, as soon as I sat down on the bed, the frame broke right away. First clue as to just how bad this place really was. We didn't spend too much time in the room though, as we planned to go to a movie that night anyway. We just quickly dropped off our bags and left. By the time we got back, it was around 11 p.m. or so. I was really tired, and I had quite a bad migraine. I quickly changed for bed and laid down, hoping I could just fall asleep. My head was really throbbing. My fiancé did the same shortly after, and before long, we both drifted off. Before I continue, I'll explain the layout of the room briefly. As soon as you walk in, to the right are two beds with a night table in between them. To the left was a table and a dresser where the TV sat, and if you kept going straight, you would walk to the sink and bathroom area. A typical hotel room layout, really. My fiancée always needs to face the door when she sleeps, as it makes her feel more at ease. She was pressed up right against my chest, so it woke me immediately the moment I felt her suddenly jolt up. She tapped on my shoulder and whispered to me that she could hear someone at the door. She said it sounded like they were trying to get it open. I couldn't hear anything myself, but the sound of her voice made me believe she was not making this up. We sat there listening in for what felt like forever. It was only around 10 more seconds before I did hear something. It was the sound of someone trying to open the door with a key card. Before I even had the chance to speak, the door suddenly opened. Fortunately, my fiancé was smart and had put the door latch on before we went to bed. Through the crack in the door, I could just about see an eye peering in at us. I immediately jumped up from the bed and yelled, "Wrong room, buddy." The man then mumbled something unintelligible. Whoever it was, they seemed to be under the influence of something, or speaking in a language I couldn't understand. What he did next, though, didn't need words to explain. He tried with his whole body to shove the door open. I yelled at him again, this time with more force in my voice, trying to scare him away. I'm not the most imposing guy, but I am somewhat well built for my height and size. I was unable to, though. After I shouted at the man, he stopped pushing on the door for a brief moment before charging his shoulder into it, trying to break it down. My fiancé screamed and told me to stop the man from coming in. From what I could see through the door's crack, the guy was pretty hefty. Had to be at least 6 feet 1 inch and over 250 pounds. There was no way I was going to be able to stop him with just strength alone. I grabbed the car keys off the table and held them in my hand with the keys between my fingers. I decided that if this man managed to get into our room, I would swing until I could not anymore. I ran over to the door and flung my whole body against it, throwing the man back just enough for the door to shut again. He immediately charged back and threw his whole weight into it, screaming something I couldn't understand. Next to the door, there was a window where I finally got a good glimpse of the man. It confirmed his predictions of his size compared to mine. To my surprise, I also saw a woman who I could only assume was his wife along with 2 kids by their side. I couldn't believe this guy was acting this way in front of his own family. I was snapped back to reality by my fiancée screaming that she was going to call the police. Suddenly, the man stopped and I could see him ushering the woman and kids away into an SUV. Moments later, they shot off into the night. I didn't know exactly where they went, but I told my fiancée to call the front desk anyways to let them know what just happened. Nobody answered, so I decided to go to the desk myself and speak to whoever was working that shift that night. I walked into the lobby where a line was already forming, so I had to wait. After about 20 minutes, I was second in line when a lady approached the counter and spoke. When she started to speak, the words she said sent a chill down my spine. "Hey, we just used this key card to get into the room, but there were already people in there." It was the wife, the man who'd almost busted down my door. I immediately started to look around. Once I looked behind me and out the doors that open into the lobby, I could see the same man standing there beside his SUV. I didn't make a move, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I turned my head back toward the desk and kept it that way. The lady left with a new key card. It was then that I approached the desk and explained what happened to me. The lady behind the desk told me it was her fault. She had given those people the key to our room by accident. I was so angry that this woman seemed to act as if whatever had just happened to my fiancé, and I wasn't anything to be particularly concerned about. I told her to write down a note that I would be back in the morning to speak with the manager about leaving early and getting a refund. I was more pissed off than I cared to admit. My fiancé didn't want to stay there for the night, but it was already too late to find another place. We relented, and once morning hit we packed our bags and made our way to the front desk. We fully expected the manager to have been filled in on what happened, but once we got there we found out that was not the case at all. The manager didn't know anything, and even said he'd asked the woman working the night shift if anything in particular had happened that night. She told him no, that nothing had. I was more pissed off now. The manager gave us a refund and checked us out early, while apologizing profusely. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Thankfully, the rest of the trip was pretty great, and we had a good time at the resort. I'm glad my fiancé had the awareness to put the latch on the door that night, because without it that man could have simply walked right in. Even with his family standing right there, he acted like a deranged lunatic. I was prepared to attack him if he managed to get inside. Something really horrible could have happened that night over a simple misunderstanding. Always be aware of your surroundings and never compromise when it comes to your personal safety. This happened back in 2012 when I was still attending college. Me and a few friends of mine opted to band together and rent out a one-bedroom apartment near the campus area. We were a bunch of party animals back then, and we wanted our own place, so we could indulge in that lifestyle without worrying about our parents or the school's administration. The apartment complex was located in a rather unsavory part of town. The cops were called out there at least once a week to break up fights or respond to reports of break-ins. All we ever did there was shower and sleep, having to overhear domestic disputes and arguing through the walls all the time. It was just part of the deal, though. One night, my roommates went to a party while I stayed behind to study for an upcoming exam. Aside from Tupac playing somewhere in the upper levels, things seemed pretty quiet. It was around 11 p.m. or so when I heard a strange sound coming from the hallway outside the front door. It sounded like a large metal object being dragged across the concrete floor. There was also a muffled noise, as if someone was saying something, although I couldn't quite make out what the words were. This went on for about 10 minutes, before there was a loud smashing sound. It was at that point I got up and made my way over to the peephole. At first, I didn't really see anything. I just waited and observed, to see if anyone would pass by my door. About a minute later, a figure wandered into view, and stood between my door and the door opposite from it. It was a Caucasian man. I'll list 3 things that instantly made every alarm bell in my head go off. First off, the man was not wearing a shirt and was profusely sweating. There was also a large axe in the man's right hand that he was dragging behind him. Last but not least, whoever this deranged individual was, he had a black leather gas mask on that completely hid his face from view. I was awestruck at what I was seeing. This was the kind of character you'd see in a low-budget horror movie. This kind of shit doesn't happen in real life. It was a real shock to the system. As if reading my mind, a creepy muffled voice then began singing. As soon as the man finished his verse, he lifted his left leg and heaved the axe into my door. His movement was so fast that it caused me to stumble backward. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard another voice from further down the hallway. "Hey, what the fuck are you doing?" I rushed back to the peephole. The masked man was now gone. To the left of my front door was a fire escape, where he was able to make a quick getaway. I then saw the apartment security guard step into view, with his taser already drawn. "Hey, do you want me to call the police?" I shouted through the door. "Yeah, if you don't mind." "All right, I'm heading out to cut them off." I immediately called the police and explained the situation to them. Unfortunately, the masked man managed to evade both the security guard and the police as well. The complex was surrounded by a small forest, and there were just too many ways for the man to escape. After the lease was up, I moved out of that hellhole. A lunatic pacing up and down the hallway outside my door, wearing a gas mask and dragging an axe behind him, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a terrifying experience, but I can look back on it now and sort of laugh a bit. I hope you enjoyed my story, and stay safe out there, guys. I saw a thread a little while ago. I think the title of it was something like, "Has anyone seen a shadow person?" I've never really believed in things like that, but recently I've turned from a skeptic into a believer. I want to share my experience here. You may laugh at me, or you may just feel as if you've seen something similar. The thing I read about said that these shadow beings, if you ever see them, aren't really that harmful. Well, I can't exactly say whether that's true or not. It is just a random thing I found online. I've read some people's experiences where they do seem to be harmful. The shadow thing I saw, though, I'm not exactly sure what was going on. Let me just tell you about what happened, though. It happened while I was waiting in line to board an oncoming train. I was leaving a friend's place. A friend of mine had moved, and I wanted to stop by and wish them well. I was absent-mindedly gazing out towards the tracks when something caught my eye. It was a person. Well, not quite a person, I guess. Something human-shaped that appeared on the tracks. It was raining out, but it wasn't really affecting my vision. I had to blink and rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. I couldn't really tell if this figure was a man or a woman. All I could see was a shadow. This is going to sound completely strange, but it almost kind of looked like a television searching for channels, but darker. You know, the static sort of thing. One thing I noticed almost instantly, though, about this figure on the tracks, was that it appeared to be missing a part of its left leg just below the knees. I couldn't really make out any facial features of this shadow, obviously. I could tell that the head had a strange shape to it. It looked like part of it had caved in or something. This all probably sounds like the ramblings of a madman. I didn't really have time to fully process or question it, though. There was a train pulling in. I really still thought it was a person on the tracks, despite how strange this appeared. I was shocked that no one else around seemed to be reacting to it. Not one person in the line for the train seemed to see what was unfolding. A tiny announcement rang out along the platform, and we were told the train was approaching and to keep away from the tracks. I thought that if there really was a person there, they were about to be mowed down. I began to panic. I don't think anyone else around me was even paying attention. They were all staring down at their phones and talking with their friends. I heard the train's brakes as it approached the station. It approached the figure, and I clasped my hands to my ears, expecting to hear screams and shouts, but I heard nothing of the sort. Honestly, I thought I was going crazy at that point. The train stopped in front of me, and I decided to take a look back toward the tracks where it had been. I saw that whatever this was still there. I was about to get on the train. I wanted to get away from here as fast as possible. I couldn't believe what I saw next. As I was about to board the train, whatever this thing was peered over at me. Although I couldn't make out any features, I could just feel it looking at me. Next thing I felt was a prodding on my back and a voice snapping me out of my stun. "Miss, can you get out of the way? There are people that want to board the train, you know." Apparently, I was holding up the line, and I hadn't realized until that moment. I didn't really know what else to do, other than to apologize and move aside. I backed off the train, causing a bit of a scene. I watched the train leave, and saw that shadow thing was now on board with the other commuters. It was looming over a passenger standing by the door, almost appearing to study her. I didn't really know what to think anymore. I worried about that passenger, and I worried about myself too. Was that even real, or was that something that I just imagined in my head, and I'm losing it? This happened to me when I was in 4th grade. I'm now 42. The internet as we know it wasn't around back in those days, so unfortunately, I don't have any news articles to corroborate this story. I do have a very vivid memory of what happened that day, though. The day my friend nearly lost her innocence, and possibly her life as well. Here's the backstory. I've always had this very strange habit that I still do to this day. I don't know what causes it, but I've always walked on my tiptoes when I would go to school. I would usually get picked on a lot for this strange behavior. No matter how much I tried walking flat-footed, I'd always somehow end up back on my toes without even doing it consciously. This led my family to believe I was destined to be a ballet dancer of some sort. As much as I loved the dance, I was also a tomboy, and I preferred climbing trees and doing sports and stuff like that. My mother worked 2 jobs, and took me to the community center and signed me up for ballet classes. I thought I would definitely have to learn how to be more girly, and like dresses and stuff like that. The dance instructor's name was Milani. She was impressed by my skills, but wasn't crazy about my height or my parents' economic status. This was a very expensive class after all. At the end of my audition, I was told I was too tall and awkward. What a nice way of building up a young girl's confidence. When I exited the classroom and entered the hallway, I heard Milani say under her breath that she wouldn't teach poor kids no matter what. I stopped what I was doing and turned around. "What did you say?" That's when she replied, "I don't teach trailer trash, okay?" My face became extremely red. At that moment, I decided I wanted to knock her on her pompous ass. But before I could react, I felt a hand on my shoulder, followed by a man's voice. "You got a real fighter in you. You ever thought about trying out some karate?" Mr. Diaz was a well-known and respected karate instructor in our county. He wanted me to try out his class, and even offered to take me in at no charge. He said I would be his first female student, but he saw some real potential in me. I still owe him a lot for that. When I first started training, he noticed my weird tiptoed footing, and rather than mock me for it, he showed me how to use it to make my legs stronger. To this day, I'm still solid muscle from my calves to my thighs. It was around that time that our small town on the coast of North Carolina was being terrorized by a man who would try to abduct young girls. He would grab them and have his way with them. When he was done, he would bind their hands together, blindfold them, and cross into another town, dropping them off somewhere random in the middle of the night. A real sick bastard. For some reason, he didn't kill any of his victims, but his MO suggested he was becoming more violent with each incident. I remember Mr. Diaz changing his lessons for a week or two because of these incidents, and teaching us how to use momentum against our attackers, how to get away, and how to properly attack the eyes, nose, groin, and face. He also emphasized the buddy system, and told us to scream fire, or say we were having a medical emergency if something was happening to us. On the day in question, I was in 4th grade. It was springtime at the time. I was with my best friend Jenny. Jenny and I decided to take a little walk around the neighborhood we lived in. This neighborhood had 2 main entrances, and formed a circle with 2 parallel streets in the middle. Homes were lined along each road no more than 1.5 acres apart, some even closer. It was very easy to come into one entrance, leave out the other, and not be seen by anyone, even if you were paying attention to the vehicles that were passing through. Jenny and I were on the main road, heading toward the back. We were just being a couple of young girls, talking about boys we liked, and the man that had been terrorizing our state. A girl we knew named Kelly had actually been one of his victims. She turned from a real social butterfly into a psych ward regular. She even tried to take her own life at one point. As we were talking about this, I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing a strange car approaching us very slowly. Immediately, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The car was a Pontiac with a faded maroon or burgundy color, and the driver was wearing these thick red-rimmed glasses and had tight, blonde, curly hair. He had his window down already. He stopped the car beside us and called out to us, "Hey there, girls. I'm trying to pay my electric bill, and I can't seem to find the office anywhere. Can you tell me how to get there from here?" Coincidentally, the electric company in our town wasn't even a mile away from our neighborhood. In fact, you could walk straight through the woods and show up right on the front doorstep. The only way to pay to turn on the service was in the office itself. This was a small town way back in the day, remember? The driver said that he had to go there to avoid his electricity shutting off. Knowing he had to have been there before to turn it on, I told him, just go there. That's when I noticed an open map beside him on the passenger seat. He explained his mother had been the one to turn on the electricity, and he was new to the area. Just came back from deployment or something. Can you come over here and show me where it is on the map? He beckoned Jenny over to his car. Jenny was unaware that something was off here. I looked around and saw no one else was around us. I quickly turned my attention back to what was going on. I could immediately tell something bad was going to happen to Jenny if she got any closer. There was a look of evil on the man's face. "Thanks, sweetie. You can point it out to me right here." His eyes locked with mine, and he gave me a smile. That's when I grabbed Jenny and pulled her away. Jenny started to scream. I looked up and saw the man had reached over and grabbed a hold of her arm. The car began to roll forward as he tried to pull her in and drive away. I wrapped my arms around Jenny's upper body and pulled as hard as I could. I knew it was going to hurt once I fell onto the asphalt, but that was okay. As long as I still had a hold of Jenny, everything would be all right. I managed to wrench her from his grasp, and we both hit the road. It really hurt. Luckily, some of the neighbors had heard us screaming, and all came out of their homes. I pulled Jenny close to me, and the man sped away in his car. One of the bystanders, a mother of one of my other friends, got the tags of the man and a detailed description of what he looked like. That man we encountered that day was the same man who had been preying on young girls all over North Carolina. My mother made every effort to keep me sheltered before that incident, and it got even worse after this. Now that I'm a mother myself, I can sort of understand better now. Jenny was very grateful that I helped her, and I'm glad to say that she's still doing well. The girl I mentioned earlier, Kelly, is an example of what could have happened to her if I hadn't intervened that day. Kelly has a rough life and doesn't really speak to anyone anymore. I don't really know all the details, but that guy ended up being arrested. I often think back to that day at the community center where I was scoffed at by someone who thought I wasn't worth the investment. Thankfully, Mr. Diaz saw the potential in me. He was the guiding voice in my head that day, and if it wasn't for all the things he taught me, I wouldn't have been able to save Jenny. I live in a pretty small town, and I have a pretty quiet life in all honesty. I have an office job and work some pretty long hours, so I don't really get out all that much, especially not at night. On the night this experience took place, I got a call from a friend of mine. To be honest, I almost didn't even want to pick it up. I was so tired. I'm really glad that I did though. Turns out my friend had called to say that she really needed a ride. I didn't mind as I didn't have any other plans. I was just a bit tired like I said. She needed to be picked up from a big supermarket. I guess she bought a lot of things and didn't want to take all of that on the crowded train home with her. I was all too happy to help. It was a little late to be shopping though, around 11 p.m. or so. I needed a couple of things as well, so I decided to head out to the store to meet her. The supermarket was almost empty at that time of night. It was usually really busy during the day though. She waited for me to pay for my own things, and we headed out to the parking lot. I think it was around midnight at that point maybe. That was when a group of men emerged from a nearby game center. It's a place that's sort of like an arcade if you don't know. I think these guys came out because the place was about to close. They headed to their cars while talking amongst each other, but they looked over at us before getting in. My friend said to me that she wasn't feeling well, and we decided to get going. We pulled out of the parking lot, and a couple of the other cars followed on behind us. That was normal enough though. It was closing time, and the lights in the retail park were all going out. I noticed my friend was really quiet. I thought it was because she wasn't feeling well. I looked over at her, and she looked very pale though. She looked at me and said, "I think I know that guy in the car behind us." I didn't immediately think much of it when she said that. I thought it was just some coincidence. I went to look in the mirrors to see if I knew him too. But then my friend suddenly said not to look back. I realized why she was so uncomfortable when I tried to pull over to let the guy pass by. My friend snapped back at me and said not to stop the car whatever I do. I did as she asked, and she decided to tell me what was going on. That's my ex-boyfriend. If you stop, I'm scared he'll come and try to do something to us, okay? This was more serious than I thought. I made my mind up not to drive down highways. I wanted to avoid traffic lights, which would mean we would have to stop. For some reason, my car does this thing where when the car stops, the doors automatically unlock while the car is in drive. I decided to take the back roads. And man, that was a bad idea thinking back on it. I probably should have gone to a late-night diner or a convenience store or something. You know, somewhere bright with a lot of people around. I think my friend would have freaked out though if I even tried that. I kept driving down these countryside lanes, the back roads, until my friend calmed down a bit. The car behind us was very blatantly following every turn we made. The further we went from the city, the fewer cars were on the road with us. It got to a point where it was literally just that car behind us, speeding up and forcing me to go faster and faster. I asked my friend why this guy was even chasing us in the first place. She said she thought she had made him angry somehow, and that she didn't want to stay at her place alone tonight. She began to cry and I didn't really get my answer. The situation we were in was getting more and more dire. I didn't know how this was going to end, and I didn't want to consider the possibilities either. I just kept driving. There wasn't much else I could do. Then something occurred to me. I had quite a small and light car, and the car behind me was much bigger. So what if I went down a very narrow road? Maybe that would stop the guy from chasing us. He would surely damage his car if he tried. I decided to take that risk and turn down a very narrow trail. I kept my eye on my navigation system to make sure I was on the right track. I didn't want to end up stuck down a dead-end road. I obviously also didn't want to send my friend home in the state she was in. I thought about trying to call the police, but I knew the police wouldn't do anything about this guy. They only ever help after the fact in Japan. My friend was sobbing next to me and apologized for getting me into this mess. Maybe I should have sensed something was up from the beginning. She hadn't ever called me for a ride from a supermarket before. She said she'd called me because she didn't have anyone else she could turn to. I told her it was okay. I just wanted to know where I should take her. She replied anywhere but back to her house. If we managed to lose him, he'd just show up right there waiting for her. She asked if I could take her to the train station. I said that I could, but she should probably stay at my house for the night. She vehemently refused. She said she'd already caused me enough trouble. At that point I realized something. All the stuff she'd bought at the supermarket looked like stuff for if she'd been planning to run away. She even had camping equipment as well. I never knew she was in such a bad situation. I didn't fully understand what was going on, but I did know one thing. The man who was chasing us was very bad and very dangerous. She said she would stay in a hotel that night, get off the train somewhere far away, and lay low for a while. Hop from hotel to hotel, and make sure her location changed every now and then. I really felt bad for her. She said he was always watching her and knew exactly how to find her no matter what she did. It was all so scary to me. I didn't want to ask her much about her ex because I thought she wouldn't want to talk about it, but I was curious about things. She said it was not just him who would be looking for her. It was his entire group of friends. They would always search for her and bring her right back to him. That was frightening. Something really bad was going down here. I followed the narrow roads back to the city and got her to the train station, just like she asked. I was sure the man wasn't following us anymore. He must have given up by now. She got out at the station, and we found out that the next available train wouldn't come until 6 a.m. obviously. I couldn't leave her there for that long. We went to a McDonald's, and I thought we could talk things over a little. I was right. She told me more about the situation. That ex of hers didn't take being broken up with very well. He attacked her and made threats against her friends and family. Tried to use fear to coerce her into getting back with him. At that point, she turned to me and said, "I want you to forget about me, okay? I'm not going to have anything more to do with you. It's very sad to lose a friend, of course. But I didn't know if getting involved with all these scary stalker guys would be good. And being chased by random men at night didn't make me feel safe." I was feeling conflicted, though. She cried and kept saying it was all her fault. After dropping her off at the train station and helping her onto the platform, she turned to me and gave me 10,000 yen. She said she'd always be grateful for that night. And that was the last time I ever saw her. I had tears in my eyes as I drove home from the station that night. As I was driving away, my tears felt like they instantly dried up when I noticed a certain car in the lane next to mine. I couldn't believe it. The guy who had followed me earlier was still out here searching for us. I tried not to make it obvious that it was me. He didn't appear to have noticed it was my car. After 4 or 5 frightening minutes, he turned off in a different direction. As soon as I got home, I crashed out. It was the first time in a long time I had been awake that late. Despite everything that happened that night, I'm glad I answered her call. I don't know what might have happened to her if I didn't, but I don't think I could live with myself. Like I said, I never did hear from her again. Fast forward 3 months later, and I got a surprise call from my friend's number. I was interested to see how she was doing, so I answered it right away. I found out it wasn't my friend on the other end of the phone at all. The person on the other end asked, "Hi, have you heard from my friend's name?" Calling from her number, it seemed a bit weird. I knew he was likely one of the guys who had been chasing her. I was scared to say anything, but I managed to say that I hadn't heard from her in a long time, and that I couldn't help them. They hung up right away. I was so scared, even though it wasn't happening to me. I did have a way to contact her through a separate messaging app, but I deleted it and never dared to use it, just in case one of those men or her ex had a way of tracking those messages. I believe she managed to start a new life, and although that call was scary, it did tell me that they never managed to track her down. I hope that my friend is still out there somewhere. They're safe and living a happy life to this day. This happened when I was very young. Since this is technically still an active investigation, I'll omit certain details from the story. For some context, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming. As a non-outdoorsy kind of guy, growing up in the cowboy state wasn't exactly exciting on any level. As a side note, I didn't really appreciate my home state when I was younger. I was going through my rebellious stage, and eventually I moved to Chicago and went to school there for years. After I finished up my education, I moved out to San Francisco, where I resided until 2016. By then, I'd had my fill of city living and hightailed it back to Wyoming. I now live in Cheyenne. In my hometown, there was virtually no crime in my area. It was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked all night. The only thing that we kids had to contend with was boredom. However, there was one incident that shook the entire community. It was one that I just so happened to witness firsthand as well. The year was 1991. I was in elementary school at the time. Back then, the school that I went to was located in between several small coal mining towns. They didn't have schools of their own. Some of these communities were over an hour away. For whatever reason, though, the school didn't provide bus rides to students who lived in these remote areas. My mom didn't get off work until around 4 or so, and it took her about 45 minutes to come pick me up from school. There was a playground located in the schoolyard, where students who were being picked up by their parents would hang out unsupervised. On the day in question, me and another child named Thomas were the only ones on the playground when class let out that day. I noticed there was an old pickup truck sitting in the parking lot, ominously facing right toward the playground. Of course, I didn't think it was very ominous at the time. I didn't really think anything about it at all, really. I didn't know Thomas very well, and we didn't really talk to each other either. I remember I was trying to do some chin-ups on the monkey bars while he was sitting on the bench near the parking lot. I eventually got bored of the monkey bars, though, and walked over to sit on the slide so I could get out of the sun for a while. Shortly after, I heard Thomas talking to someone. No, I don't know you. I'm not going with you." I was facing the opposite direction. The main playground area sat between the slide and the bench Thomas was sitting on. When I looked over, I could make out a figure standing next to Thomas. The only thing I seem to recall about them is that they were wearing a pair of faded jeans. My memory gets a little fuzzy after this, which is disappointing because I prided myself on having a pretty good memory. The only thing I remember after noticing the mysterious person talking to Thomas was seeing the truck speeding out of the parking lot and realizing that Thomas was suddenly gone. I didn't see Thomas getting into the truck. I didn't even realize he'd been grabbed until the day after. My mom arrived about 10 minutes later. The next day, I was called into the principal's office and was asked by a police officer if I'd seen Thomas the day before. I told him about the strange truck in the parking lot and seeing someone talking to him while I was on the slide. Unfortunately, the story does not have a happy ending. Thomas's body was found in a ditch a week later in the neighboring state of North Dakota. It was less than an hour away from the school. The tragedy shook the entire community. A lot of parents blame the school for not having someone out there watching us, which is a perfectly valid point of view in my opinion. After what happened to Thomas, not only do they have a chaperone out there watching us at all times, but a police car was also stationed in the parking lot. It wasn't until I got older that I realized just how lucky I was to not be taken that day as well. I potentially came very close to meeting the same fate as Thomas. The scariest part about all of this is that they were never able to find who took him or what their motive was. It happened out of nowhere for seemingly no reason. It's a scary thought to imagine someone just waking up one day and deciding to nab and murder an innocent child right out of the schoolyard. I don't think living in constant fear is healthy at all. However, we must be aware that evil lurks everywhere, even in the most remote and unassuming places. This happened roughly an hour ago. I, 14 and female, was walking my dog Stella around the neighborhood. I'd been at a craft fair all day and was super tired because it had been raining and I hadn't managed to pull in much money. I was asked to walk Stella just after I'd gotten back with my mom, and I said yes. We headed out and I was strolling along, keeping an eye on the sky. It was looking like it was going to start pouring at any time, and I didn't have a raincoat with me. Just an oversized hoodie. I heard a car turn down the street I was walking on with Stella, but I didn't give it much mind. I could hear it getting closer and closer to me until it eventually started to slow down. I assumed that whoever this was must be turning into a driveway, but I looked back just to be cautious. The car, I believe a Chevrolet, although I'm not quite sure, had no front license plate. The car didn't turn into a driveway either. I was a little more than unsettled now. I heard it getting closer and closer to me. I put Stella on the other side of me, away from the road. I was even more frightened when I heard one of the doors of the car open as it was driving. I remember muttering to myself, "Oh fuck, here we go." I'd better be able to scream well. A hand grabbed my wrist out of nowhere and jerked me toward the car. I wrestled with this guy for a few seconds and began to scream. I hadn't screamed in quite a while. I'm a very quiet teen unless I'm with my friends. The dude jerked his arm again. Stella, being the silly goof she is, finally realized I was in danger. She pounced on the guy and sunk into his leg with her jaws, making him scream like a little girl. She was not letting go. The guy loosened his grip on me by now, and I seized the opportunity to kick him hard enough to make him drop me. He shrieked and let go of me, at which point Stella released his leg. I picked her up and sprinted back to my house. I caught the back license plate, though I don't exactly remember it now. It was from New Brunswick, though. I am in British Columbia. I'm scared to think how far the two men would have gotten with me if Stella had not defended me that time. This happened when I was much younger. I used to have a part-time job working for a liquor store in downtown Osaka. The area I worked in was known as the entertainment district, so I was often busy running back and forth. We delivered alcohol to pubs, bars, and certain nighttime entertainment venues. We would always be particularly busy around the New Year's period. I wouldn't even have a single minute to myself. Now, I'm not proud to admit this on the internet, but I have a very weak stomach, so whenever I'm out in the cold running back and forth, I usually need to go to the bathroom after. With my embarrassment now out of the way, I can go on with the story. About halfway through my shift, I realized I needed to use the bathroom really badly. Normally, I would just run back to the liquor store, but I knew I wouldn't have time to make it. So, under the cold December sky, I ran around the entertainment district in search of an open bathroom. Thankfully, there was a convenience store nearby. I said hello to the guy working the register. I knew him, so I headed into the bathroom area. I was appalled to see that there were two people standing in front of the closed bathroom door. They were waiting in line for their turn as well. One guy was an elderly-looking businessman. The other guy was much younger, blonde hair, probably in his early 20s. Looked like he was out for a night on the town. Since there weren't any better viable toilets in the area, I decided to wait in line for my turn here. Whoever was in there seemed to be in no hurry to leave at all. We were just standing out there, trying to hide our feelings of impatience. It was taking far too long. After 15 minutes had passed, we hadn't even heard the flush of the toilet, nor the hand dryer or anything. Not really any sounds at all. It felt like whoever was in there was never going to come out. The blonde-haired guy suddenly banged on the bathroom door and yelled at whoever was stuck inside. "Hey, what the hell, man? Are you sleeping in there? Come on. I've been waiting out here long enough." Moments after that, we heard some noise from behind the door. There was a strange rustling sound, followed by something that sounded like chuckling. I guess some drunk guy had passed out in there and was now waking up. I was relieved because I was on a ticking clock sort of situation. 3 minutes passed, and then 5, and now I was really reaching my limits. I should have just run back to the liquor store. I would have made it back by now. At this point, I noticed something strange. The soft chuckling noise I'd heard before was now getting louder. It grew louder by the second, and I heard something like someone stamping their foot inside. Like there was cartoon knee-slapping laughter going on. It was so weird and unsettling sounding. I don't know if I'll be able to accurately describe what happened next, but I'll try my best. If you told someone to do an impersonation of as many styles of laughter as they'd ever heard, it was sort of like that. Like someone mimicking laughter, but in a completely disingenuous and unnatural way. Like they didn't understand what laughing even was. It was just plain disturbing to hear. I didn't think whoever was behind that door sounded drunk anymore. They sounded like something was really wrong with them. Like they were deranged. We were all getting the creeps now. The office worker was staring at the door, and so was the blonde-haired guy. We all just couldn't take our eyes off it. The blonde-haired guy called out to the store employee that someone was on drugs or something inside. So the clerk rushed over and tried to get our versions of events. After we told him what was going on, he went off and returned with some keys. Looked like he had the master key to the bathroom. By this time, everyone else in the store was forming a mini crowd. They must have been drawn in by the commotion and the strange laughing sound. The clerk called out through the bathroom door. "Hello, sir. Are you feeling unwell in there? I'm afraid I'm going to have to open the door now." We all watched as the clerk unlocked the door and pulled it open. I imagined I would see some guy, slumped in the corner, bleary-eyed. That was not what I saw, though. There was nothing in there, apart from this really small, weird-looking doll sat on top of a closed toilet lid. It was small and dirty, and it looked worn out. It looked so out of place. It looked really old, too. Clearly not a toy kids these days would play with. There were no windows in the convenience store bathroom. So where the hell had whoever was in there gone off to? It left us all completely speechless. I don't know what the hell happened that night, and I probably never will. Whenever I tell people about this, they never believe me. I've had the following responses. Number 1, that they can't believe anyone would wait so long for the bathroom. And number two, they couldn't believe everyone was that patient. I understand their criticisms, but there were a lot of witnesses there, and nothing I can figure out can explain why the door was locked from the inside, and all the sounds of moving and stamping and maniacal laughter. At least nothing bad happened to me, so I guess I can be grateful for that at the very least. But it was a very creepy experience, for sure. So I used to live in a little town in north-central Florida, on 3.5 acres of wooded land. There were very high canopies there, so high in fact that the moonlight couldn't shine through. That meant the property was always very dark at night, abnormally dark compared to other places. Before I bought this place, the property's previous owner had shared a morbid piece of history with me. There had once been a trailer out front, where an old lady used to live. I guess she owned the land originally. One evening she was pressure canning, when the cooker she was using suffered a catastrophic malfunction, which severely injured that old lady. Apparently she laid there for quite a while, suffering before she died. You could still see the very foundation where the trailer was once parked. After moving in, I had some bad run-ins with the neighbors. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I've always just felt a negative energy there in general. At the front of the property, opposite where the old trailer used to be, there's a long driveway that led up to a workshop. It was about 2,000 square feet or so, with 2 roll-up metal bay doors on its west side and a regular door facing the south towards my house. The workshop had very high fluorescent lights and was outlined with shelves and cabinets, with a rectangular wood bracket for a television. There was also shelving high up in the corners, where you could mount speakers if you wanted to. I spent a lot of time in there alone. The isolation always did creep me out a bit, but this was my workshop. This is where I got things done. The property's previous owner, the guy who told me about the old lady, used it to work on motorcycles in there, I guess, so it was already set up as a mechanical repair shop. The building was roughly 10 meters or so away from the house. It was around July of 2012, I believe. I was working in the shop, and the doors were closed. It had been quite a rainy month, and I was trying to keep my tools from rusting, unsuccessfully, mind you. I was in the middle of cleaning up an antique revolver. I had probably been in there for about an hour or so, when some lightning struck close by. It startled me, so I waited about 5 minutes to see if this would pass. Little joke about Florida: if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes or drive 5 miles, and everything will change. As I was wrapping up, though, the lightning hit the front of the shop directly, coming through the front and striking the concrete base. Bits of concrete and sand blasted at the side of my neck. I cringed in pain as the lights went out, plunging the shop into complete darkness. I remember running towards the door on the south end, which faced my home, and kicking it open, revolver in hand, as if I was going to go shoot the storm or something. The true ruthlessness of this storm was now vividly displayed in front of me. Rain was rushing past me into the darkness of the now powerless shop. I stood there for a few minutes, wondering if I should run the 100 or so meters to the house. Another strike landed nearby, and I decided to get out of there. As I was running through the rainfall, I immediately began to slosh in knee-high water rapids that I hadn't noticed before. Water was rushing all around the front of the property. My pace was really slowed by these flooding waters, now constantly beating against my legs. I got within 30 feet of the sliding glass doors of my home. Safety was within my grasp. I stepped out of the rushing water and onto the small concrete slab, which was a few inches elevated. It had once been the foundation for the aforementioned trailer. Before I could even bring myself to slow down, I slid into the accumulated 4 inches of water that was gathered in my yard. I was now completely soaked, covered in muddy water. Without hesitation, I brought my legs off the ground and onto the landing, and opened the sliding glass doors. Not a moment later, lightning struck again, hitting a pine tree not 6 feet away from where I'd been. I was blinded by the flash of light. I rose to my feet and slapped my muddy revolver on the countertop, then ran toward the staircase. Under the staircase was a large desk where the family computer used to be, so I decided to take refuge under there until this storm passed by. Within seconds, lightning hit my house. Another blinding flash enveloped me, my arms and legs seized up. The lightning had blasted through the roof and struck the floor tiles, causing them to explode. I quickly began to remove everything metallic I had on me. My wallet, my steel-toed boots, my watch, my belt, even my wedding ring. I tossed it all into the living room. Every muscle in my body was on fire, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't breathe. I imagine it's because of all the adrenaline rushing through me. I laid there and started to shiver. It took what felt like forever for the lightning to fade, and for the storm to eventually subside. Later on, while surveying the damage with my wife, we discovered several charred bits blown straight out of the walls and blasts of tile upstairs. I've had quite a few years to reflect on the situation that night. I still get uncontrollable anxiety and feel like I'm not safe anywhere, like I could be struck by lightning at any time. Sometimes I wonder if the heavens were angry with me that day. I'm a 17-year-old male from England. When this took place, I was 16. It was December of last year. Me and my mates live in a small village located about 20 miles south of Manchester. 2 minutes on the train from us was a larger village, which we would frequently visit. We attended school there. There was also just a lot more stuff to do. Our small village didn't exactly offer much for a bunch of amped-up 16-year-olds. There was this old abandoned office building in the larger village that was about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the village center, where all the shops and stuff were. The old office building was very creepy. It was especially a frightening sight to look at night. Each floor was the same. A huge office space to the right of a staircase leading to the black stairwell. To the left were the toilets and various other side rooms. We would sneak in through broken windows and then cover them up so no other people would know we were there. Once in the building, the first thing we did was go up onto the roof and get a bird's eye view of the village below. One night, me and 3 of my buddies decided to play a game of hide and seek in the old building. The rules were that the seekers had to count on the roof and give the hiders at least 5 minutes before coming down to look for them. After several rounds, and even changing up the teams a couple of times, one friend and I decided it would be a good plan to hide near the ladder. That way, when the seekers came down to find us, we could discreetly climb up and hide out on the roof instead. After successfully making our way up without being seen, we stayed there for about half an hour. The 2 seekers eventually got bored of looking for us and came up to the roof, where we then jumped out and scared them for a laugh. "Dash, how long have you guys been up here?" one of them asked. I kept saying we had been up there the whole time, and he looked at me really confused, but didn't really say anything else. I thought that was a bit of a weird reaction, but didn't really mind it. We decided to play one more game before heading out. It was now our turn, so we started the timer and the former seekers descended the ladder. Once 5 minutes had passed by, we began our search for them. Once we got to the top of the stairs, I looked in through one of the big main offices where you could see the black stairwell. I saw one of the hiders walking down them. I thought I would be sneaky and go down the main stairs and cut them off. But when I got there, they were already gone. 15 minutes later, me and my partner were getting bored and a bit creeped out. We knew they had to be somewhere in the building because we kept hearing these footsteps and doors closing and what sounded like things being dropped on the floor. We decided to cheat and FaceTime one of the hiders. When my friend picked up though, we were mortified to see the Christmas lights outside of the building. They had ditched us, and whatever we were hearing was not our friends at all. We immediately hung up and looked at each other before hauling ass out of there. After meeting up with the other 2, they went on to say that to get back at us for outsmarting them, they thought it would be funny to leave the building altogether. Knowing someone else was definitely in there with us. After calming down because I was really pissed off at them, we all then talked about what we saw. My friend explained that when they were trying to find us, they'd both seen someone in the back stairwell. They'd also heard people talking and heard doors opening and closing. What sounded like random things falling to the floor too. When they both realized we were actually on the roof, that's when they decided to leave and play their little prank on us. I responded by telling them that I'd also seen a figure on the back stairs and how we'd heard the exact same things they did. To this day, I still have no idea who or what was in there with us. We had been in that building several times before and never encountered such a problem. We never even saw another person. For hours on end, we were playing hide and seek in there, completely unaware that some person or even multiple people were in there with us. It makes me sick. The building was demolished a month after this happened, and they plan on replacing it with a housing development. So this has to be the strangest thing I've ever experienced. At the time, it was very unsettling. I'm from the Bristol area in the southwest region of the United Kingdom. Back in July of 2001, I was working my first job at a local department store while studying for my final GCSE exams. I was 16 at the time, and I used my pitiful first month's wages to buy my first mobile phone, a Nokia 3210. At first, everything was perfectly normal, and I was enjoying the novelty of communicating while on the move. I was sending short messages and all that sort of thing, until I started getting these random missed calls. They were always from a future timestamp as well. I would always get these bizarre calls either during my shift or just before it started. When I would check the details, it would display the same date and time on every occasion. One missed call, no number. December 31st, 2049. New Year's Eve, nearly 50 years into the future. These cars always came from a quote, no number. It didn't say unknown number, mind you. It said no number. I had no idea what that could possibly mean. That was certainly unusual, especially for cell phones in the early 2000s. Most people I tell this story to try to rationalize this by saying, oh, the phone date was just set incorrectly. But I proved them wrong by showing them that the phone was displaying the correct date. I would have chopped this all up to a one-off glitch had it happened only once. But I lost count after it happened 20 times over the space of 1 month. I remember on the 11th time it happened, I managed to catch the call as it was ringing. When I picked up, I heard this strange garbled noise. It was almost like the chirping and whirling of an old dialed-up modem mixed with the sound of someone choking or something. Unfortunately, it was too distorted to make out any words if there were any. I've tried searching forums, chat rooms, and various other websites for a few years afterward, looking for any kind of information about this phenomenon. I found nothing. The call stopped around December of 2001. But the creepiest thing was that every time I missed one of these calls, this sensation would come over me, like someone was suddenly watching me. No one was ever in close proximity to me, though. When I found out I had missed a call, I remember even trying to take photos of the screen with another camera as evidence. Somehow, though, all the pictures came out unfocused and blurry. Remember, 20 years ago, we didn't have cameras built into phones, and screenshots weren't a thing either. I used to love posting on Instagram. It was a place I could show off my new clothes, hauls, and the compliments from friends and internet strangers alike really boosted my confidence. You see, I was something of an ugly duckling when I was a teenager. I was bony, I had braces, and I was totally lacking in self-confidence. And as shallow as it sounds, it was social media apps like Instagram that really helped me get a real sense of self-worth and made me feel pretty. But towards the end of last summer, a guy happened to slide into my DMs, paying me lots of compliments and saying all kinds of nice things about the things I was wearing. I have to admit, I really enjoyed the attention, but he wasn't really my type, so, as silly as it seems, I just kept the conversation going for a few days, chatting back and forth and stuff. Eventually he asked where I lived. I told him I was in Cambridge, and he told me he was from Ilford in East London. Then he asked if I fancied going out sometime. I told him it was a bit far to go for a date. It's like an hour's drive between here and Ilford, and aside from that, I thought he might be a bit too old for me. He was 28 and I was 19 at the time, but that didn't put him off at all. He kept insisting that we should give the whole dating thing a go. I just didn't have the heart to tell him no outright, so, again, as silly as it was, I just kept stringing him along by telling him maybe, or we'll see and stuff. One Saturday morning, the guy asked me what I was up to over the weekend, and I told him I was out shopping with a few friends. I'd be picking up some new outfits, and I'd be posting them to Instagram, so he and everyone else could see what I'd bought. He said he was looking forward to seeing them, and that seemed like the end of it. Then a few hours later, I was going from shop to shop on Cambridge High Street, not a care in the world, when I happened to see a familiar face across the street. It was him, the guy from Instagram. I was stunned. He'd driven all the way up from London after asking me what I was doing just so he could know where to find me. I remember getting really nervous, so much so that my friends started asking me what was the matter. I kept quiet about it for a little bit until one demanded to know why I was acting so strange, so I told her. I told her everything. And as I actually said the words, "I think he's stalking me," I broke down crying in the middle of a busy shop. She was so supportive about it, though. She waited with me in the shop and ordered an Uber on her phone, telling me everything was going to be okay, and that there were things we could do to stop this from happening, and how the guy wouldn't be able to get away with it. About an hour later, I was home and safe, but I was so upset that I had to tell my parents what had happened. My dad was furious. He couldn't understand why I'd been posting pictures of myself online for anyone to see, and I suppose I don't blame him. Back when he was a kid, there was nothing remotely like Instagram, where you could just go online and look at pictures of total strangers. He wanted to take my phone off of me, but I told him that there were things I could do to make myself safer, like blocking the guy and making my account private. He said it was far too late for that, but the guy knew where I lived, and I suppose he was right. A few days later, I walked out of my house, heading over to my friends who happened to only live around the corner. Ours is a very small, close-knit community, So I happened to notice a car that wasn't normally parked in our quiet little neighborhood. But when I looked and saw who was in the driver's seat, I froze. It was him, again, the guy from Instagram. I was so scared. I had no idea how he'd been able to find out exactly where I lived. And the only thing I could think of was that he'd been following me around town for days. Maybe he'd even followed that Uber that I'd taken back to my house. But it was what he said to me that I found so disturbing, the way he phrased it. "You need to come with me." I ran back into my house, shouting for my dad, who came hurtling out of his little office, asking me what the matter was. When I told him he was outside, he knew exactly what I was talking about, and his cheeks flushed red with rage as he grabbed my hockey stick from out of the cupboard and walked down the front path towards the street. I didn't follow him, but I heard the shouting. He kept telling my dad the same thing he told me, that I needed to go with him, but with no other explanation as to why. My dad told him to get lost and that, if he came back, that he'd beat the life out of him. But he did. He kept coming back, over and over again. The police said they couldn't do anything about it initially, that we needed to make a log of the times he was visiting, and to take pictures if we could. So that's exactly what we did. Every time he showed up, my dad would go out with the hockey stick in his phone, take a few photos before scaring him off. He was amazing like that, but I won't lie, it put a real strain on our family, and I could tell my dad was getting really tired of having that same drama unfold week after week. Once we had enough evidence that the stalker kept returning, my dad didn't go outside when he showed up. He just called the police and explained that he had about 6 different pictures detailing different times this guy had showed up outside our home. Only then did they actually bother to send anyone. There was a huge kickoff when they did. At first, they just politely asked the guy to move along, but he refused and, for some reason, kept telling them the same old thing, that I needed to go with him. That's when the police tried to arrest him, and he resisted, telling them they had no right to. It was only in February of this year that we actually got any resolution on the whole thing. On the 21st of February, the guy was sentenced to 21 months in prison at Petersburg Crown Court. He had pleaded guilty to harassment and resisting arrest. The thing is, though, I don't know if that's actually solved the problem entirely. I know he won't be turning up outside for just less than 2 years, but what about after that? What if he decides he's not finished with me, and he continues to turn up outside my house? I thought the prison sentence would be the end of it, but only 21 months. What if he's angry about it, gets out and decides to hurt me? I just can't stop worrying about it. I can't get it out of my head. The whole thing has completely ruined my life. Last summer, I met a guy called Michael through the online dating app Tinder. He was lovely at first, very charming and funny, and we ended up going on a few dates to some local cafes and bars that actually went really well. But at one point he started getting really possessive over me, acting like I was his girlfriend and getting really jealous and stuff. At one point I got a text message from him asking me who the bunch of guys were that I was friends with on Facebook. I told him the truth, they were just old school friends or people I knew through work. But this didn't satisfy him at all, and he demanded that I unfriend them. Obviously I told him that I wasn't going to do that, and it was really unfair of him to be asking me to do something like that, especially considering we haven't even been dating all that long. That's when he started getting really abusive and paranoid. He was convinced that I was dating other people on the side, and that I was just using him for free drinks and food. That was a ridiculous accusation on its own, as I'd always made a point of splitting the bills with him. I work, I'm independent, and I don't need a man to pay for things for me. Eventually I got really sick of the way he was acting, and I told him I didn't want to see him anymore. But he kept trying to contact me. At first he told me he was sorry, and that the past relationships had ended badly with infidelity, and the like, which was why he acted so paranoid over things like that. But I made my mind up. I couldn't go out with someone like that, and a friend of mine had made a good point, that if he acted like that once he was bound to do it again at some point. I asked him to leave me alone, but he wouldn't. So I ended up blocking his number on WhatsApp, as well as blocking him from actually calling me entirely. But his attempts to contact me didn't stop there. He used every means that he could. Eventually he got a hold of my work email, and started sending me messages there too. I couldn't change my work email, but I could block the sender, yet that didn't stop him. He made a brand new email address for every email he sent me. I had to block him on Facebook too. I had to block him on Instagram. Every single social media platform I had was bombarded with messages, and some of them were really frightening. At one point, he even managed to get a hold of my PayPal username, and sent me payment requests for money that he said I owed him for drinks and food we had on our dates. He threatened to end his own life if I didn't get in touch, and sometimes he threatened to hurt me too. Some of the messages were really graphic too, where he described ways with which that he'd take his own life, or take my own. He was obviously putting a lot of real thought into it, and that's what gave me sleepless nights. But I think the worst thing was that he kept getting in touch with friends and colleagues of mine, even family members, trying to tell them what a terrible person I was, and how he was going to hurt me if they didn't get me to respond to his messages. In total, I received over 4,000 emails, over 300 phone calls, and hundreds of messages from him. I have had to change my whole life to ensure that my children and I were kept safe throughout the ordeal. I still have to maintain this, and my life will never be the same again. But I kept a lot of the messages handy, so that when I finally broke in contact with the police, I had a shed load of evidence on hand to show them, and this was all they needed to arrest him. Michael was sentenced to 12 weeks in jail, suspended for a year after pleading guilty to stalking in Liverpool Crown Court. He was also handed a 5-year restraining order, which stopped him from contacting me. I finally feel like I've had some justice regarding the whole thing. He might not be going to prison for the things he's done, but he's certainly in a position now where if he does try to carry on stalking me, he will be put away, which, frankly, is where people like that belong. If there are any women reading this who are going through a similar situation, please be brave and keep hold of some of the messages for evidence. It's the only way to prove that it's happening, and it's the only way the police will actually do anything about it. I'm a student here in Hong Kong. I've been really stressed out with all the political stuff that's been going on lately, but somehow I've managed to get myself in a situation that's made my life even more unbearable right now. You see, although I live in Hong Kong, both my parents were born here, and I speak fluent Canto. I spent the first 7 years of my life in North Carolina, so if I'm honest, sometimes I feel way more American than anything else, and I speak fluent English too. I feel like I identify much more with American culture a lot of the time, and I'm a huge nerd for things like Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy role-playing games. So as a result of the lockdown that's been imposed here over the past few months, I found an outlet for my geekiness, and that's Discord D&D groups. They're just awesome. If you can get yourself a good dungeon master who's actually creative, they can be a lot of fun. It's literally exactly the same as being sat around a table playing, only it's even easier to share pictures of characters and scenery and whatnot. So recently I was playing as part of a group when my character gets romantically paired with another character for the sake of the story. I get pretty invested in my characters, so I play the part as convincingly as I can so everyone can get as emotionally involved in the story as possible. And it actually ends up being a pretty amazing campaign that ends up in a few characters dying, which we were all devastated about. Now usually everyone is pretty clear that it's purely a role-playing thing, and that it's basically just acting out a character for the sake of the campaign, but the guy I'd been paired up with ends up contacting me outside the D&D game. He said it was the best he'd ever felt playing out a campaign, and wanted to know if he could keep in touch with me, so he could invite me to future games and stuff. Of course, I told him sure, that it was one of the best campaigns I'd ever played, and that I'd love to get involved with future games, especially if he was involved. He played his character super convincingly, and he was a great writer, able to describe thoughts and feelings in a way that others just couldn't seem to. Then a couple of days later, he starts asking me a lot of out-of-character questions, inquiring about my real life and such. I figured he was just being friendly, and people have been getting pretty lonely during all the lockdowns that have been going on, so I suppose I'd indulge him, letting him get to know me maybe a little more than I should have. Then he came out and asked me if I would ever consider doing a long-distance relationship. I told him those were never a good idea, no matter how much you like someone, as they tend to put people into really unfair positions where they can't pursue local relationships with people they might even be better suited to. It was then that he started getting kinda reticent, like his replies got all short and monosyllabic. I asked him if he was feeling okay, and if I'd said anything that he found upsetting or something, and he straight up went and told me that he really liked me, and would I consider having a Discord date with him via video chat. I told him I didn't think it would be a good idea, that what happened in the D&D game was just like acting, and that it wasn't real. Then he got really mean. He told me I was a liar for making a guy feel like I had, then just pulling the rug out from under him, so to speak. He told me I deserve every bad thing that happens to me, and he'd personally see to it that I suffered the punishment for the pain that I caused him. For a guy in his 30s, he was the most emotionally immature person I'd ever met in my life, and I'm used to hanging with freaking teenagers. I just blocked him, and thought that that would be the end of it. But more recently, I've had all kinds of Discord friend requests off of people that have turned out to be this same guy, trying to add me over and over again. Sometimes he'd pretend to be someone else, only to give himself away with some little detail. It made me incredibly paranoid, to the point that I've had to stop playing D&D online altogether, because he continually infiltrated as many groups as possible, simply to try and find me. Some of his messages were just apologetic at first, but as I ignored them, they got crueler and more violent with each instance. The one that scared me the most was just a list of all the things he knew about me. My name, the university I study here in Hong Kong, even the names of my parents and brother. I don't even know how he'd gone about getting his hands on that kind of info. All stuff he'd managed to find out on his own through some stalkery detective work. This creep had obviously put a lot of time and effort into finding out additional stuff about me, and it's his level of determination and zeal that seriously freaks me out sometimes. Like, how far is he really willing to take this? I know he's far away. I know he's in the United States, and that means there's enough distance to make me feel a lot safer than I would otherwise. But I'm terrified he'll just show up in Hong Kong and track me down. Like there aren't many girls here that have the American accent I do when I speak English. Like he's much older than me, he has a job, has money saved up and stuff. Like there's literally nothing that could stop him from doing something like that if he really wanted to. And I think someday he might actually want to. But it's some of his threats that have really made me feel nervous. Like how he's told me that if I don't give him a chance, he's going to email some of my university professors to tell them how I've been cheating on assignments, plagiarizing the works of others. Accusations like that are taken very seriously by the university. I had no idea a friendly little D&D game could end with me being in this almost constant state of anxiety, like every day. Guys online can be really creepy and misinterpret just basic friendliness as being flirting or whatever. I'm not saying it's everyone, but it's enough to turn some girls' lives upside down. Like I trusted this guy. He seemed really nice, and now he literally has the power to ruin my life if he chooses to. Like me personally, I'll be taking much more precautions when it comes to what information I reveal online in the future. I used to work as an events manager for a very successful nightclub here in New York City. It was honestly a dream job. A professional party planner is something thousands of young people dream of being able to do for a living. My phone is filled with selfies I've taken with literally hundreds of VIPs, big-name house DJs, rappers, sports stars, you name it. I pretty much spent my weekends meeting famous people and partying, all while getting paid pretty handsomely for it. But then quarantine happened. At first, we were put on furlough, which was a pretty sweet deal. Sure, it sucked having to stay indoors pretty much all day, but I was still getting paid 75% of my salary just to settle my butt and watch Netflix or do yoga. But then rumors started to go around that the club wouldn't be reopening, which I honestly thought was crazy at first, since the place was making bank before the lockdown, and the owner was definitely wealthy enough to keep it going, no matter how much various business expenses were costing him. But then one day, we all got an email confirming our worst fears. The club was shutting down indefinitely, and as much as it pained him to do it, we'd all been laid off. I was absolutely devastated. I just broke down crying right there at my laptop, and they were those real ugly tears. I had no idea how I was going to pay rent for the foreseeable future. I don't know about you guys, but a $1,200 stimulus check was barely going to cover a month's rent, and I haven't even really got much in the way of family to lean on. The only jobs I knew of were temp jobs in nursing homes, and I knew I couldn't do anything like that. I was complaining to friends online, generally feeling sorry for myself and begging for a few dollars, when one made a weird suggestion. She told me about a website called OnlyFans. I'd actually never heard of it at the time, but when I Googled it, I actually got kind of annoyed that she'd even suggested it. I'm not some e-girl, and I can count the number of guys I've slept with on one hand, and they've all been long-term boyfriends. Okay, so for people that don't know, OnlyFans is basically just a place where people can put up photos, videos, audio files, all kinds of things, and put them behind a paywall. Sounds innocent enough, right? And it can be, but OnlyFans is more famous for other stuff. Adult stuff, which is where the real money is. I told my friend that I'd have to be desperate to resort to posting stuff like that online, but she came back with the fact that they don't have to be outright nudes. They can be just lewds, which apparently is an actual term that's thrown around in those sort of circles. She went on to tell me that there's a huge market for so-called real girls like girl next door types, which is most definitely the kind of look I have. All I had to do was put up a few freebies, just kind of like showing myself off, and put some raunchier shots or videos behind a paywall and see what kind of response they got. I didn't even have to show my face. I think that's what sold it, covering up my tattoos, and no one would ever even know it was me, right? Besides, it was try it or risk getting evicted. So I picked out a few bralettes and booty shorts that I thought were cute, took a few pictures, and then uploaded them to an OnlyFans account that I'd started. Then I posted some of the tamer shots to a subreddit called Mild, which would basically serve as advertisements. I got instant attention. Hundreds of upvotes trickled into the thousands, and a steady flow of messages from thirsty guys all received the same copied and pasted responses in return. Hi, thanks for your lovely compliments. If you'd like to see more of me, a lot more, sign up for my OnlyFans account, along with a link to my page. A handful of guys who told me to die, basically saying how they were only interested in free content, how any girl that actually charged for that kind of stuff or whatever was well, you get the idea. But just enough were interested in me to actually sign up to my OnlyFans and pay the $30 monthly fee I demanded in order to see more of me. Every time I posted in Mild, I got more followers, and it got to the point where not only was I able to pay my rent on time, I ended up making considerably more money than I had in my old job thanks to OnlyFans' tipping system. Basically, fans can make requests, and you can fulfill them for a little extra cash. For example, one dude offered me $500 to show my face. Just my face. Nothing lewd, nothing like that. As he put it, it'd be worth the cash just to see me smile. By the end of the first month of posting, I was making serious bank. My friend was right. It was low risk, high reward. Or at least, that's what I thought. So about 5 weeks after I started my OnlyFans, I walked down to a local grocery store to pick up some food. Like most places, there was a queue winding out the front entrance since the store was only allowing a certain number of people inside at any one time. So I'm just standing there, alternating between checking my phone and just sort of people watching, when I notice a guy across the street stop walking and begin to stare at me. He had a long beige coat on, slick back hair, glasses, and like a lot of other people walking around, he had one of those disposable medical masks on. He was incredibly creepy, but this is New York. It's full of creeps, and he wasn't the first older dude to try to start an impromptu staring competition with me, nor do I think he'll be the last. So I just sort of ignored him and carried on checking my phone. I didn't figure he'd be creepy enough to start anything in broad daylight. And besides, if he had a mask on, there was little chance of him coming within 6 feet of me, I assumed. Only when I get my grocery shopping done and head out back into the street for the walk back to my apartment, he was still there, still staring at me from across the street. Again, super creepy, but nothing I was about to freak out about. So I just start walking back towards my apartment. But he just follows me, stays on the opposite sidewalk, sure, but follows me nonetheless. The last thing I wanted was to lead this creep right back to where I was living at. So I take a couple of wrong turns, walk him around in a circle, and eventually lose him entirely. I mean, it was irritating that I had to even do something like that, but that's just something us girls just have to do from time to time, I suppose. Let me just take the time to say that obviously not every guy is a creep like that, and it never seems to be the guys I want to follow me home that ever do so. But it's enough guys to make it a problem for us. So I finally get within a block of my apartment building like an hour after I thought I'd be home. It's incredibly hot outside. I feel sweaty and gross, and I'm just looking forward to jumping in the shower to get cooled off. What do I see waiting outside my freaking apartment building? Yep, the creepy guy in the long beige coat. Not even the summer heat could have stopped the chill from running up my spine. Like, how in God's name did he know where I lived? Out of all the apartment buildings in Williamsburg, he just happened to guess which one was mine. Something was going on. Something real bad, and I had a feeling I was about to find out just what that was. I decided to just bite the bullet and walk past the guy. If he tried anything, I could always just threaten to cough on him or whatever. Failing that, knee to the balls, then call the cops. Only as I'm getting closer to him, and he finally locks eyes with me, he addresses me in a way that makes me just freeze in my tracks. He uses my OnlyFans username to get my attention. I pretend not to know what he's talking about, but he's all like, I know it's you. You can't lie to me. And for the first time, I felt this deep sense of shame at what I'd done. Which is weird because I don't really have any regrets, but in that moment, I felt like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. He told me it was nice to finally meet me, that he'd paid me a lot of money, and that he didn't think he'd gotten all that he was owed. I broke and just straight up asked him how he knew where to find me. I know the admission wasn't the wisest move, but like he said, there was no point in lying by that point. Besides, I just needed to know so I could maybe avoid this happening again in the future, if I even kept my OnlyFans up at all. He just laughed at my question, in the most horrible, patronizing way, like it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. Then when he told me, I felt like face-palming so hard. I'd been dumb enough to take some pictures that showed the street outside my apartment. Nothing with too much detail, but enough for some entitled psycho like him to put a little work in to figure out where I lived. I couldn't believe how short-sighted I'd been, how my own greed had gotten me into a potentially dangerous situation. The guy then asked if he could have my phone number, so he could stay in touch properly. I told him he couldn't, and that my boyfriend wouldn't be too happy if I did. The whole boyfriend thing was a lie, but I figured it might deter him from getting too weird. But that's when he started getting really, really mean, apparently outraged that I could be using something like OnlyFans to get money when I should be making all that kind of thing exclusive to my boyfriend. I got sick of trying to be reasonable with the guy, having figured that being nice was the surest way to keep myself safe. He didn't try to block my way as I went into my building, nor did he try to follow me up the stairs, but he did spout a tirade of passive-aggressive abuse at me about how I should be loyal to those that love me and all this other stuff. I've deleted the OnlyFans account now. I just about have enough money to last me until I get a new event planning job, or just any other job at all. But this guy knows where I live now, and I know next to nothing about him. I don't know if he has a violent history, I don't know if he's hurt women before, and I don't know what he's planned for me now that I have tried to let him know that I'm not available. I'm so worried about what my future holds, or if other creepy obsessive people have been able to work out where I'm living based on those pictures I took with a view out of my window. I know it was dumb of me to start that account in the first place, but lockdown has put us all in a bunch of very difficult situations, and I think I'd rather be dealing with a stalker problem than a homeless problem, as crazy as that might sound. But if anyone has any experience with anything like this, or any advice, don't hesitate to write about what you know in the comments. I'd be really grateful to anyone that can help me keep this guy at arm's length. So I ended up matching with this girl on Tinder a few summers back. She was this punk girl, all kinds of piercings with short cropped bubblegum pink hair. She was cute, really cute, and she actually seemed really into me. The weather was horrible in the afternoon that we matched, typical British summer here, and I was in no mood to go traipsing around in the rain. But it didn't seem to bother her at all, and she wanted to make plans for that evening despite it being such short notice. Now, I'm a planner, I like having notice about doing stuff, and I really don't like being spontaneous at all. I don't know why, it just makes me nervous, so when she insisted we meet that evening, I wasn't keen on the idea at all. But she just sort of charmed me into it, so we met for drinks with her, giving me lines like, take a chance and live a little, stuff like that. Now that I look back, it was a total imposition, and that should have given me a clue right there, but let's just say I was thinking with my other head. So the first date goes pretty well, we did seem to actually have a lot of chemistry, but it was weird in that after like a few drinks, she's all like, what are you up to after this? I tell her I'll probably just go back to mine, and she responds with, can I come, yeah? Now, I know that seems way too fast, but like I said, I wasn't entirely thinking straight, so I let her come back to mine, make her some pasta, then we fall into bed together for you know what. The next day we hang out a little, grab some food, just chill stuff, but I'm completely expecting her to leave to go back to her place at some point. Only the later into the evening it gets, the more I realize she has absolutely no intention of doing so. So I start dropping hints to her, mentioning how tired she must be, how I probably don't have enough food on hand to make a meal for two, blah blah blah. It's not like I didn't enjoy her company, I just wanted my own space, you know what I mean? We seemed to go from 0 to 100 over the course of 24 hours, and as cute and charming as she was, I was just not ready for that. In the end, I had to just spell it out for her. I felt rude, but I just laid it out that I had work to do in the morning, and I had to be responsible and get a decent night's rest, because we both knew that wouldn't be the case if she was leaving my bed again. I tried to blend the harsh truth with a little compliment or something, but it didn't go down well, not at all. She got really upset, getting moodier and moodier as I tried to continually soften the blow, explaining it wasn't her, that I really liked her, stuff like that. Then as she gathered up her things, she started to cry. I was upset too, devastated even, and thought she might be girlfriend material, but she really wasn't. I'm not one for drama like that, I don't think many people are, so the idea she could become so bloody unhinged so quickly, it really knocked the wind out of me. She left in the same flood of tears, and no sooner had she gone, I was typing up an apology text to try to make her feel better. I felt awful, I really did, but I knew the really hard part would come over the next few days when I'd have to explain to her that I couldn't see us working as a couple. But before I could, I got a text off of her asking if she could come round to mine again. She hadn't even gone 24 hours, and she was asking to come back, like the little drama from the night before had never even happened. That was deeply disconcerting, and I felt constricted, strangled, so I had to just do the right thing and tell her the truth. So I typed out this long, equally apologetic message, telling her what I was thinking, how I couldn't see us together, that I just wasn't ready for a relationship, whatever came to mind that might soften the blow, and then hit send with a silent prayer. I didn't get anything back. We were using WhatsApp by that point, and I knew she'd actually read the message from the 2 little blue ticks that denoted it had been seen. But she didn't reply, and that's when it all really started. That evening, she was shouting in the street up at my flat window, telling everyone what a terrible person I was, how I'd gotten her pissed as a fart on that first night, and then taken her back to my flat and assaulted her. I couldn't believe this was the same girl. Seeing the rage that poured out of her, the way she screeched and barked up at my flat window, never did I imagine she was capable of anything like that. But there she was, telling everyone who walked past or opened their window what an evil, manipulative person I was, destructive and deserving to be in jail. It was without a doubt the worst experience of my life. I remember just sitting there on the couch, fingers plugged in my ears, imagining how my life was about to fall apart around me. My friends would turn on me, my family would shun me, and eventually the police would turn up to arrest me and charge me with something I'd never even think about doing. You'd think it would be my turn to cry then, but I was just numb, completely and utterly numb before the complete and all-consuming fear hit me. I know I should have just phoned the police and cut off the accusations, but I was convinced they'd side with her, that basically there was nothing I could say that would convince them that I was in fact the victim in the situation. She came back twice over the next week, no matter how much I begged her over WhatsApp to just leave me alone. The one night I thought she might turn up, and she didn't. I thought it might have ended. But as I left my flat and walked down to grab a few tins of Stella from the corner shop, I saw that she'd daubed something on the doors of my apartment building. It said my name is a predator, and he lives here in flat 4, it said, in bright yellow paint on the dark red door. I had to go from apartment to apartment, 6 others including my own, and explain what was going on to the people that lived there. 2 slammed the door in my face, and neither were girls either. The only 2 girls that lived in my building actually listened, with one sympathizing with me. The other told me that if it was true, she hoped they'd throw away the key, but that didn't bother me because I knew it wasn't. Weirdly enough, the girl didn't actually go to the police. In retrospect, this is because she had been charged with making a false complaint and wasting police time, which in some severe cases can actually end in a jail sentence. But for about a month, she made my life complete torture by getting in touch with pretty much everyone she could and telling them all about how I was a predator. I was constantly fighting fires, be it with friends, family, work, colleagues, neighbors, you name it, and I had to tell them the same old story, a story that took on this stale, terrible air of repetition to it that got more intense every time I told it. Then one day, finally, it just sort of seemed to peter out. There were no more messages from people close to me like, "What's this I heard about you? Please tell me this isn't true." No more from unknown numbers that said, "You're going to get what's coming to you," or "We're going to get you when you least expect it." It all just sort of ended. But the nightmares didn't end, nor did the sense that every little look from a stranger was about to turn into them punching me in the face or worse. My life had been well and truly turned upside down, not destroyed completely, but it was enough. I just want to end this by making it clear that that is an abhorrent crime. But so are false accusations, harassment, and inciting violence against an innocent person. And please, if this happens to any of you, go to the police immediately. It's what I should have done, and maybe if I had, I'd have a little more of my sanity left intact. I'm a general practitioner at a small medical clinic here in the UK. In March of 2017, I had a young woman show up to an appointment for a routine checkup, nothing outside of the ordinary. It went fine. She was pretty much in perfect health, and I told her as such before wishing her well in that sort of, "We're done here, now please leave" kind of way. Only instead of leaving, she starts to make casual conversation, asking me about my interests, if I enjoy being a doctor, stuff like that. She's flirting really, really hard, like aggressively so. Despite the fact that this made me a little bit uncomfortable, I had a wife and a newborn baby at home. I obliged her at first, just making general chit-chat with her until it was fast becoming time for my next appointment. So obviously, in the nicest way possible, I tell her I'm a busy man and that I needed her to leave so I could see my next appointment. She seems a bit disappointed, but she seems to understand, grabs her things, and leaves. I suppose she was just lonely or something, so I didn't really think anything of it, and to be honest, I'd completely forgotten about the girl a couple of days later. About a week goes by. I get into work nice and early, and I'm sipping on my coffee while I'm going through my appointments for the day. Then I see a name that's vaguely familiar to me, but that's not unusual at all. I have loads of regular patients that I see sometimes twice or thrice monthly, but I know these people in first-name terms, while this name I couldn't quite remember where I'd seen it before. When it comes time to see this particular patient, I'm actually kind of looking forward to it, simply so I could find out who this person was and put the whole question of why does this name seem familiar to rest. Then when the patient walks in, it's the flirty girl, and that's where I'd seen the name before. She'd already told one of our receptionists that she's been experiencing stomach pains, sometimes so severe that she wasn't able to sleep. But when she walks into my office, she's looking good, acting perfectly normal. She doesn't seem tired or in pain. In fact, she's obviously spent a lot of time doing her hair and makeup, not to mention being overly flirtatious as usual. I ask her about her symptoms, and she insists that she's been having the most horrific stomach pains, reiterating that it's been making sleep almost impossible. So I give her a quick look over, and there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with her, but medical issues involving the digestive tract can be very difficult to get to the bottom of. I ask her about her diet, whether or not she's eating anything overly spicy or acidic, to which she replies that she eats very healthily, sticking to salads and the like. Now I'm starting to suspect that she's just making these appointments to be able to get to talk to me, which I know sounds a little bit arrogant, but I just really got this feeling in the pit of my stomach. So towards the end of the appointment, I just come out and ask her if there's any chance that she's just making up symptoms as a way of being able to see me. Obviously, she's all like, "What? Me? Never." And let's just say she wouldn't be winning awards for her acting anytime soon. So I just take her word for it, pretending that, of course, she'd never lie about something like that, and of course she's genuinely experiencing horrible stomach pains. I tell her to keep an eye on her diet, make sure she's not eating anything that might irritate her bowels, and make it clear that she should make another appointment if it carries on, as I might have to refer her to a specialist. Cut to about a fortnight later. I'm in my office just typing up a few prescriptions when I get a call from the receptionist telling me there's something going on in the reception area of the clinic. I ask exactly what's going on, but she sounds really shaken up and just says that I need to come down to reception immediately, as there's a patient of mine there who's demanding to see me. Puzzled as to what it could possibly be, I walk down to reception, only to see the flirty girl leaning on the front desk, and she looks terrible, actually terrible. She's not bothered to do her hair or makeup this time. She looks really pale, and she's obviously in a lot of pain. Right as she sees me, she turns, looks me in the face, and says, "I told you I had stomach pains," and proceeds to vomit blood all over the floor of the reception area before collapsing onto the floor. Obviously, we call her an ambulance, and she gets rushed to accident and emergency for treatment. And the entire afternoon, I just feel absolutely terrible, like I'd ignored this girl and assumed something deeply self-centered and arrogant, having totally neglected my duty of care. I try to get through the rest of the day. I tried my very best to stay focused on the rest of my appointments, but it was tough. I couldn't get the image out of my mind, that horrific mental image of the poor girl looking like death, looking so confused and let down before the bloody contents of her stomach slipped from between her lips and onto the surgery floor. At the end of my shift, I called up the hospital the poor girl had been taken to and waited patiently until I could get a hold of the accidents and emergency team number who had dealt with her. Funnily enough, it turned out to be a doctor that I knew from many years before, one who I actually knew from university. So after a little catch-up chat, I asked her about a patient who had been admitted that afternoon having vomited blood in a surgery just outside the city center. She knew exactly who I was talking about, and at that, I sort of broke down and told her about how foolish I'd been, how I'm pretty sure I'd verged on being negligent in my diagnosis of her. But she stops me in the middle of my little emotional breakdown and tells me that the girl refused to talk to them, that she insisted on going back to see me, and that the only thing she could think of was that apparently she had attempted to end her own life. Those words sent me into a spiral of confusion. I asked her what she could possibly mean by that, And that's when she told me that they had to pump the bleach out of her stomach by inserting a feeding tube to fill her stomach with a fluid that basically flushed the bleach out of her system. Basically, the girl had drank bleach in some misguided attempt to see me again. It had almost ended her own life. I'd never had a stalker before, but I suppose that's exactly what she was. A completely mentally unhinged young woman who would go to any lengths to see me again and to prove that her lies were actually the truth. It was horrifying, thinking there are people that obsessive that they'll do something like that, but I suppose that's just the world we live in. I'm a PT at a fairly popular chain of gyms here in Australia. I had a girl who used to turn up to all the spin classes I ran, every single one, until she ended up giving herself an injury. And even then she continued to turn up and openly take painkillers in order to get through the sessions. Eventually I had to take her aside and advise her that she should seriously consider taking some time off to let herself recover, and she burst into tears saying that she couldn't bear not to see me. I tried to be kind and told her that I loved her enthusiasm and stuff, and that it'd suck not to see her too, but she needed to do what was right for her body. Then she asked me if I wanted to see her outside of work, but I had to decline her. I had a steady girlfriend at the time, and I knew she'd not be happy about me seeing this girl, even as friends. Besides, it would be really unprofessional to pursue any kind of relationship with someone who was literally paying for my company. Then over the next few weeks, I began to see notes attached to my windshield of my car whenever I finished work. They were from the same girl, and every time they had a phone number attached, but I had to ignore them. I couldn't give her any idea that I was interested in her. Then the notes began to get nasty, really nasty. I won't repeat what they said, as they had some frankly disgusting language to them. Then one day there was a fire engine in the parking lot of our gym spraying water all over a car that was on fire. My car. CCTV showed the exact same girl from the spin class walking up to my car and dousing it in gasoline before setting it on fire. She was arrested and I chose to press charges, but she managed to dodge a prison sentence because apparently she had a history of mental illness. I also came to find out that I wasn't the first person she'd become obsessed with. I basically live in fear for my life now. I filed a successful restraining order against her, but honestly, I don't think she'll abide by it. I think she's just waiting for the right time to approach me again, and when she does, I'm really scared about what she'll do. It was a small, old store that had been around for years. I worked the evening shifts, usually from late afternoon to night, and I got to know the regulars pretty well. Most of them were friendly, always stopping to chat while I rang up their groceries. I had a routine, and I was known for being a friendly face at the register. People would always say I made their shopping trips a little better with my smile and politeness. It felt good to connect with people like that, but one night, something happened that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a cold winter night just before Christmas. The store was busier than usual because everyone was rushing to get their last-minute items before the holidays. The bright lights in the store buzzed faintly, and the air had a sharp chill that you could feel every time the door opened. I had a line of customers, and I was trying my best to keep up while staying friendly and cheerful. I smiled and chatted with each person, making small talk as I scanned their groceries. Everything was going as normal until I saw him. He walked up to my register, and the moment he stepped into view, I felt a cold wave wash over me. He was about 5 feet 10 inches, dressed in a long green jacket that looked worn out and an old black backpack that hung loosely over one shoulder. His hair was long and greasy, tucked under a cap that didn't seem to fit him properly. His face was extremely pale, almost sickly, and his large black glasses kept sliding down his nose. As he approached the counter, he didn't greet me, didn't say anything. I forced a smile and said, "Hey, how's it going? How are you today?" He didn't answer. His eyes, dark and lifeless, locked onto mine. He just stood there, staring at me with a gaze that felt empty. It wasn't the usual polite look you get from customers. It was more like a dead, hollow stare that made my skin crawl. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I rang up his groceries, I kept talking to him, trying to keep things normal. As he was standing there, waiting for me to enter, I said, "It's a busy night, huh? Are you all ready for the holidays?" He didn't respond. His eyes didn't move from mine for a single second. He didn't even blink, and it felt like time was standing still as I bagged his items. I tried to stay calm, forcing a polite smile as I told him, "Have a nice night." He didn't say anything back. He just grabbed his bags, nodded slightly, and walked away. I felt relieved when he was finally out of sight, but something about that encounter stuck with me. Not long after he left, a few more customers came through the line, and the night seemed to return to normal. I made small talk with a few regulars and continued ringing up groceries, but as I looked up from my register, I saw something that made my stomach drop. He was standing near the exit, just watching me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. It was as if the whole world around me had stopped. I couldn't look away from him, and I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. I don't know why. I guess I just didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to look paranoid or like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He was just standing there, motionless, watching me. A customer asked me a question, snapping me out of my trance. I looked away, focused on helping them, and when I looked back, he was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things, but deep down, I still felt uneasy. Something didn't sit right with me. The rest of the night was uneventful until about 30 minutes later. It was almost time for me to leave, and I was counting down the minutes. The store had thinned out a bit, and I was starting to think about the warm bed waiting for me at home, but then that feeling came back. The one that someone was watching me. I glanced around, but I didn't see anyone. The aisles were mostly empty, and the other employees were in the back. It was just me at the front of the store, but then I turned around, and there he was again. He was standing at the second exit just a few feet behind me, staring. This time, I knew I couldn't ignore it. My heart raced, and I could feel my palms start to sweat. I turned to my bagger, trying to act like everything was fine, but I'm sure my face showed my concern. I whispered to them that I thought he was the same guy from earlier, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was probably nothing. But when I looked back again, he was gone, just like before. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I told my supervisor about the situation, and since I was about to leave, she said one of the guys would walk me to my car just in case. It felt silly, but I agreed. I didn't want to take any chances. As I was finishing up, one of the cart guys, who I'll call Tom, came up to me. I started telling him about the creepy guy, and his face immediately changed. "Oh, that guy," he said. "Yeah, he's been hanging out in the parking lot for the past hour or so, just staring at the store." I felt my blood run cold. "What? He's been there the whole time." "Yeah," Tom replied. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think much of it. Then about 10 minutes ago, he just suddenly got up and ran off. He didn't even walk away. He just started running. It was strange. I didn't know what to think. I felt a little better that he had left, but I also couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Tom walked me to my car, and the whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the guy somewhere behind me. But there was no sign of him. The ride home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror every few minutes, making sure no one was following me. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see headlights in my mirror, but there was nothing. I made it home that night without incident, but the whole experience left me feeling shaken. I never saw the guy again after that night, but I can't forget the way he looked at me. How it felt like he was watching me from the moment he walked in until the moment he left. The whole thing just felt off, and I couldn't shake that feeling for days. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes and think about that night, I can still see his pale face and dark eyes staring at me. And I can still feel that cold, unsettling sensation in the pit of my stomach. It's strange how sometimes you can have one encounter with someone, and it sticks with you forever. I'll never forget the man in the green jacket, and I always wonder if he was just some odd lonely guy, or if there was something more to his strange behavior that night. But for me, it's a memory that lingers, like a shadow I can't quite escape. It all started about a year or two ago, when I met someone who would end up making my life a living nightmare. I'll call myself anonymous, and the person who made my life so hard, the one who stalked me relentlessly, I'll call Stalker. At the time, Stalker was a friend. He was someone I didn't really like, but still tried to get along with. I kept him around out of politeness, but soon enough I found myself starting to like him more, but it was only or so I thought. He always seemed to be around, always in my space. I didn't realize it at first, but he was watching me a lot. Later on, he confessed he liked me. I wasn't interested, and I said no. A couple of months later, he confessed again. I said no again, but he didn't stop. Another couple of months passed, and once again, he told me how he felt. Again, I turned him down. That's when things started to feel off, but we stayed friends. At least, I thought we were. It didn't take long for his behavior to shift. He began to follow me everywhere. At first, I tried to brush it off, but it became impossible to ignore. He started showing up uninvited, following me when I went places, making sure I was never alone. If I was sitting anywhere, he would sit next to me, and if he couldn't, he would sit in front of me, always making sure to be close. It was as if I couldn't escape him, no matter what I did. I tested it. I'd stand up and move to another part of the room, and he would immediately follow me. If I tried to go to another room, he would follow me there too. I even made a point to move around the room just to see if he'd follow, and he did. No matter where I went, he was there. I couldn't be alone. It was beyond annoying. And then came the night I'll never forget. I was walking home alone when I got that awful feeling that someone was following me. I turned around, and there he was, Stalker, hiding behind a car watching me. It was chilling. I didn't want to deal with it, so I acted like I hadn't seen him, rushing into my house without saying a word. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I told Jake, my friend, everything that was happening. Thankfully, he stepped in and helped me out. For about a month, Stalker left me alone. I could breathe again, but of course it didn't last long. As I feared, Stalker came back, and at first it seemed like he was acting normal again. I actually felt relieved for a while, but that didn't last either. Months passed, and everything started spiraling once again. I had changed friends by then, becoming close with Chris and Alex. We formed a tight-knit group of 4, and they didn't know anything about what I had been going through with Stalker. Things were peaceful, but then Stalker started getting worse. He began following me again, refusing to let me go anywhere alone. He got jealous when he saw how happy I was with Chris and Alex. He hated that I spent more time with them than I relaxed around them. Stalker would try to get me alone, acting like it was just a coincidence, but it wasn't. He wanted to be with me all the time, and it started to feel like a constant push and pull. I would try to spend time with Chris and Alex, but Stalker would do everything he could to keep me away from them. One night, Stalker, Chris, and Alex and I were all walking back together from a place we'd gone to. Stalker always tried to make it, so I would be the last person to go home. He didn't want me to walk alone. We got to the point where I would leave before the rest of them, heading down a certain street on my own. I felt a little safer when I was walking by myself, but one night I turned a corner, and there he was. Stalker followed me onto that street, the same street I thought I escaped down. After that, I could never walk home alone again. I had to take my bike everywhere now. If I didn't, Stalker would insist on walking me home, no matter how hard I tried to avoid him. It was exhausting. I told Chris, Alex, and Jake about everything that was going on, and they all supported me, but the situation didn't improve. It only got worse. One day, while we were all at a convention, Stalker followed us. Alex, noticing how uncomfortable I was, walked me to my bike. Stalker was with us, but it didn't take long before he tried to push for me to go home with him. I had my bike and needed to go home quickly, but he insisted I walk. Thankfully, Alex spoke up and refused for me, telling him I was in a hurry. Stalker reluctantly backed off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, I found out that he had lied about his plans. He told Alex that he was going to take the train home, but that wasn't true. He was supposed to walk with someone else, but he'd been lying the whole time. It felt like I couldn't escape him. I would go to play games with my friends, and there he was, always near. He would watch from the sidelines, just waiting for me to pay attention to him. If I wasn't involved in the game, he wouldn't play either. He was always around. It didn't matter where I was or what I was doing, he would be right there. The only way I could keep some distance from him was to keep riding my bike, making sure I wasn't walking anywhere alone. But it was hard. I felt trapped. I couldn't leave him behind without feeling guilty, because I'm just too nice. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I felt like I had no choice but to keep pretending everything was fine, even though I was so far from okay. I never asked for any of this. I didn't want to be stuck in a situation where someone was constantly following me, pushing their way into my life. Stalker is still in my life. I still have to see him, though I try my best to ignore him. Thankfully, my friends help me in any way they can, but it doesn't change the fact that I feel like I can never truly be free from his constant presence. The worst part is, I can't help but wonder how far he'll go. Will I ever be able to go home without him tagging along? Will he ever leave me alone for good? Sometimes on cold winter nights, I think about that feeling of someone always watching, waiting for me to turn around, and I wonder if this will ever really stop. And then, I'm left with the memories. The moments when I could almost pretend everything was fine, when I could feel safe. But deep down, I know that Stalker is still out there, still waiting for the moment when he'll make his next move. The worst part is, I don't know what he'll do next. And that thought, knowing that he could appear at any moment, keeps me up at night. Hey everyone, welcome to Aftermoon Horrors. If you love listening to spooky stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Your support means everything to our new channel. Thanks for being here. It all started with my first real full-time job after college. I had studied art, but the reality of paying bills meant stepping into an admin role at a company that offered a mix of random tasks. One of the most mundane, yet strangely calming responsibilities was working in the warehouse once a week. My job was to count and organize inventory, a task that allowed me to spend hours in quiet isolation. It was a reprieve from the noise of everyday life, and honestly, I enjoyed it. A bit of solitude now, and then never hurt anyone. That's when I first met Tim. He was in his late 40s, a rough-around-the-edges guy who had been working there for years. He had this way of moving through the office that made it clear he knew everyone and everything. Tim seemed to be the go-to person for advice, whether it was about work or life in general. He took it upon himself to offer me help, small things like explaining the workflow, showing me the ropes, and offering tidbits of life wisdom that I now realize should have set off alarm bells. At first, I thought nothing of it. He lived in his mom's basement, a fact that he mentioned often, almost like it was a badge of honor. He had a cat he adored, and he often told stories about his past life as a Hell's Angel. He even drove big rigs for a living, sharing tales of long hauls on the road. It wasn't anything special. He was just a guy at work. But soon, the harmless moments started to pile up. After a while, Tim started inviting me to lunch. I figured, why not? It was free food, and he seemed friendly enough. He took me to all kinds of hole-in-the-wall spots I never would have found on my own, places serving Cuban espresso and all-you-can-eat burger buffets. I was still new to the area, and these outings felt like an adventure. It was exciting to discover new places, and it seemed like a nice way to break up the dull work days. Tim would always claim that he was paying it forward, like his friends had done for him when he was younger. It was hard not to feel a little indebted to him for his generosity, even if it was just a lunch here and there. But things didn't stay innocent for long. After a few weeks, Tim started showing up at my apartment uninvited. At first, I chalked it up to him being well-meaning, but a little clueless. He'd knock on my door, holding a case of beer, and he'd ask if I wanted to hang out. I was still polite, even though something about it didn't sit right with me. I'd let him in, and we'd talk for a while, but it always felt like there was an unspoken expectation hanging in the air. Then one day, we were sitting in his truck after a lunch parked in the work lot. It was quiet, the kind of moment that felt peaceful at the time. But then Tim turned to me, his face serious. Without warning, he said, "I think you're the one." I froze. My stomach dropped. I didn't know how to respond, so I just stared at him, waiting for him to laugh it off or make a joke. But he didn't. His eyes were wide and intense, like he was waiting for me to say something. My heart was pounding in my chest. "I have a boyfriend, Tim," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not interested in you like that." Tim didn't react the way I expected. Instead of backing off, he just kept going. "You're meant to be with me," he insisted. "Your boyfriend isn't right for you. We're meant to be together." His words felt like a cold weight on my chest, and I tried to brush it off, but his persistence only grew stronger. I repeated myself, firmer this time. "No, Tim, I'm not interested like that. I care about you, but only as a friend. I'd please stop." I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Far from it. Instead, his behavior grew even more obsessive. He started showing up at my door, unannounced, gifts in hand. Things like a first edition of my favorite book and a necklace meant for cancer survivors. The gifts were thoughtful, but they felt wrong. They felt like he was trying to claim me in some way, marking me as his. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I tried to accept them politely, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing unease in my gut. Things escalated quickly after that. One evening, I was at home, curled up on the couch when my phone rang. It was Tim. He was crying. His voice was shaking, pleading with me to talk to him. "I love you," he said. "I can take care of you. We belong together." The words came at me like a tidal wave, and I was paralyzed, unsure how to react. I couldn't handle it. I put the phone down, hoping he'd get the hint, but instead he kept calling. That's when the threats began. Tim started leaving angry voicemails. He told me he would hurt my cat, Penny, the one I had given to him. He said he hated her and that he would bash her brains in. The chilling words echoed in my mind for days. He threatened to take her into the woods and leave her there. My stomach churned with fear. I knew something had to change. I started calling and avoiding him as much as possible. But Tim didn't stop. It wasn't just me he was harassing, it was everyone around me. He started sending messages through other coworkers, telling them how hurt he was by my sudden disappearance. He said I had abandoned him. He even started calling from random phone numbers. And every time I picked up, I heard that familiar, disturbing voice. "Hello," he'd say, and I'd hang up, heart racing. It never stopped. Eventually I had no choice but to change my phone number. I thought that would be the end of it. But Tim didn't give up. It was like he had nothing left to lose. A year later I got a call from him again. He had somehow found me, and his story had changed. He claimed he had found the one, and that he was finally moving on. But then he dropped the bombshell. He was dying. His voice was shaky, and he described some rare illness that only a specific surgery in my state could cure. He begged me to meet him, to say goodbye. Then he added something strange. He said his fiancée was pregnant, and that we'd both be parents at the same time. I felt my blood run cold. Was he manipulating me again? What was his game? I knew I had to myself, to protect my family. I was pregnant at the time, and the thought of him showing up at my door, uninvited, was unbearable. I blocked everyone from that town on Facebook, just in case they were unwittingly feeding him information. From that point on, I changed my phone number once more. I moved as far away as I could, hoping that distance would give me peace. But even after all these years, there are nights, cold winter nights, when I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment. It's like a shadow that never fully disappears. What if he had found me again? What if I hadn't taken action? What would have happened then? Would he have shown up at my door with a case of beer, his smile wide, expecting me to let him in? I'll never know. And that's the part that still keeps me awake at night, the not knowing, the wondering, the fear that somewhere, out there, Tim is still lurking, waiting for me to slip up. It was back in 2004, a time when online dating wasn't nearly as common as it is today. It was still something a little new to people, and a lot of us had tried it out in hopes of meeting someone interesting. I had been on a few dates with local guys, but they never really went anywhere. It was one of those things where you'd meet someone, talk for a while, and then realize there wasn't much of a connection. I was feeling a bit discouraged, but one evening I was browsing a dating site and came across a profile that stood out to me. The guy was around my age, and his profile described almost identical tastes in music and hobbies. We both loved the same bands, enjoyed similar activities, and even had similar senses of humor. It felt like I had finally found someone I could connect with. So, after a little back and forth, we decided to meet up for coffee downtown. The coffee shop was bustling that evening. I remember the warmth of the cafe compared to the cold winter air outside. I was feeling a little nervous, as you do when meeting someone new, but I was also excited to see if this guy was as interesting as his profile suggested. We greeted each other, exchanged pleasantries, and grabbed our drinks. The conversation was casual at first, about life, work, and the usual stuff you talk about when meeting someone for the first time. I didn't notice anything strange about him. He seemed like a normal guy, and I figured it would be just another one of those low-pressure first dates. We sat there for a while, sipping our coffee, talking about everything and nothing. He told me he was a medical student at a local university, and I thought that was pretty impressive. Everything felt relaxed, and I had no reason to think anything was off. But as the evening went on, things started to change. The more we talked, the more I noticed that his behavior began to shift. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. His body language, the way his eyes started to dart around, the way he kept rubbing his hands over his thighs like he was trying to dry off sweaty palms. I didn't think much of it, though. I figured maybe he was just nervous, too. After all, meeting someone new for the first time can be awkward. But then, as we finished our coffee, and I suggested we head back downtown, he insisted we go for a walk instead. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he just wanted to continue the conversation. But something in his tone made me uncomfortable. His voice had become quieter, more serious, and there was something almost unnerving in the way he looked at me. As we started walking, I began to notice how tense he was. His shoulders were stiff, and he kept his hands jammed into his pockets. I tried to make small talk, but his responses were short, distracted, almost mumbled. His breathing was heavier now, like he was struggling to keep control of himself. I didn't know it at the time, but I was already beginning to feel like something wasn't right. As we walked further away from the downtown area, I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but he wasn't responding the same way. The streets were quieter, and I felt a slight chill in the air, the kind you get on winter nights when the wind picks up. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I knew I had to be careful. It wasn't long before I realized we were heading farther and farther away from the main streets. The crowds were gone now, and the area felt a lot more deserted. I glanced around, and I could see the empty streets stretching out ahead of us. I was starting to panic inside, but try to keep my cool. I suggested that maybe we should head back toward the downtown area. I turned around and started walking in the opposite direction, hoping he would just follow along, but instead he reached out and grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice low, almost breathless. "We need to sit down. There's something important I need to tell you." Alarm bells went off in my head. Every instinct told me to get away from this guy. But by then we were far enough from any crowds that I knew there wouldn't be anyone around to help if things took a turn for the worse. I tried to remain calm, but my heart was racing. He had a grip on my arm now, and I could feel his fingers tightening around me. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, so I let him guide me over to a bench. My mind was spinning, and I was desperately trying to figure out what to do next. We sat down, and he still held onto my arm. His demeanor had completely changed. The guy who had seemed so normal just an hour ago now looked completely different. He was no longer the charming, slightly nervous guy I had met at the coffee shop. Instead, he was something else, something darker. He turned to face me, and I will never forget the look in his eyes. It was predatory, cold, like he was sizing me up and I was the prey. He started talking, but not about anything normal. He told me that he had been watching me for a long time. He knew where I went, where I hung out. He knew which bars I frequented with my friends. He said he had been watching me laugh and talk with people from the crowd, lurking in the background. He even knew where I lived, where I worked, and when I had class at school. He had been following me for months, and it was starting to feel like a nightmare. And then it got worse. He told me that when he found me on the dating site, he had deliberately made his profile mirror mine. He had studied everything about me, tailored his interests and hobbies to match mine, so that he could finally get me. He slid his hand from my arm to my thigh, and it made my blood run cold. He said that now that he had me, he wasn't going to let me go. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The guy had been stalking me, had been planning this for who knows how long, and now he was sitting there, with his hand on my leg, acting like it was all part of some twisted game. The whole time he was talking, I kept nodding, pretending like it wasn't a big deal, but inside I was freaking out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get away from him. I discreetly pulled out my phone and started texting one of my guy friends. I didn't know if he could hear the panic in my voice, but I managed to tell him I was in danger and needed help immediately. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for a response. Thankfully, he was nearby and said he was on his way. I kept my eyes on the road, looking for any sign of my friend's truck. I had no idea how much longer I could keep the situation calm. My skin crawled as I felt the guy's grip tighten on my thigh. I knew I had to act fast. Finally, I saw my friend's truck coming down the street. My heart leapt into my throat. As soon as the truck was close enough, I pulled myself away from the creepy guy, stood up, and ran toward the truck. I didn't look back. I could hear the guy behind me yelling and swearing, but I didn't stop. I leapt into the bed of my friend's truck just as he sped off, the creepy guy still shouting from the sidewalk. That was the last time I ever fooled with online dating. The whole experience left me shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if my friend hadn't been there. What if I had been alone? What was this guy really planning to do? I still don't know, but it's a memory I'll never forget. I haven't been on any dating sites since that night, and every time I see someone new, I can't help but think about that winter night, the cold streets, and the look in that guy's eyes. I know I'll never truly forget what happened, and I'll always be a little more cautious about who I meet online. Hey everyone, I'm curious to know more about you all. Drop a comment below, and let me know which country you're watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches, so don't be shy, I'll be reading through the comments. This story happened back when I was around 8 or 9 years old, so it must have been in the late 90s. My parents had been divorced for several years by then, and my younger sister and I would spend every other weekend at my dad's house. It was always nice to spend time with him, even though the divorce was hard for everyone. At that age, I didn't think much about adult problems, but I do remember those weekends as being pretty special. One weekend, Dad introduced us to his new girlfriend, Rachel. She was tall, blonde, and very pretty. Dad told us she had won some sort of beauty pageant in the past, which made her seem like someone important to my young mind. At first, I liked her. She was friendly, and she had something that made her stand out. 2 unusual pets, a gray parrot and a raven that could both talk. My sister was completely fascinated by them, and I think that helped us warm up to Rachel quickly. For the first few months, things seemed fine. Rachel was kind to us, and Dad seemed happy. But as time went on, I started to notice she had some odd habits. She would say strange things sometimes, or act in ways that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't really explain why. Eventually, we stopped seeing her as often. One day, Dad told us they had broken up, and that we wouldn't be seeing her anymore. I remember him sitting us down and saying very firmly, "If Rachel ever shows up at your school or tries to talk to you, don't go with her. Come and tell me or a teacher immediately." That warning stuck with me, but I didn't really understand why he was so serious about it, at least not at first. After the breakup, things got strange. Rachel didn't seem to want to let go. She started showing up at places we visited during our weekends with Dad. Whether we were at the park, out to eat, or running errands, there she was. She would try to talk to us, smiling like nothing was wrong, but Dad always made sure we stayed close to him and didn't engage. She also started calling his house nonstop, crying and yelling on the phone. Dad eventually had to unplug the phone, just to get some peace. Years later, I found out how bad things really got. Rachel wasn't just harassing Dad, she was threatening him. Apparently, she even made threats against me and my sister, saying she would hurt us to get back at him. Dad ended up getting a restraining order against her, but that didn't stop her. She keyed his car, broke into his business, trashed the place, and stole money that he never got back. She even started sending letters to my mom, who had nothing to do with the situation. The worst part was when Rachel sent a letter accusing Dad of being a child molester. I remember that day vividly. My mom sat us down in our room, holding the letter in her hands. Her face looked worried in a way I had never seen before. She asked us gently if Dad had ever done anything inappropriate to us, and of course we both said no. It was heartbreaking to see how upset Mom was, knowing that Rachel had made up such a horrible lie just to hurt Dad. The last memory I have of Rachel is from a weekend just before Christmas. It was a cold, dark evening, and we were staying at Dad's place, which was a small, 2-story apartment. The living room had this huge window that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, giving a clear view of the backyard. There was also a glass patio door right next to the window that led outside. That night, the outdoor lights were off, so the backyard was pitch black. We were sitting on the couch watching TV, with the glow of the screen lighting up the room. My sister and I were snuggled up under a blanket, watching an episode of Superman. Everything felt cozy and safe, until I heard a strange noise. It was this sharp, scratching sound coming from the window. It sounded like someone or something was clawing at the glass. My back was to the window, and for a moment I froze. My heart started pounding as I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder. All I could see was the darkness outside and the faint reflection of the room in the glass. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my sister. Before she could answer, Dad stood up, his face tense. He walked over to the patio door and flipped on the outdoor lights. The backyard lit up, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, pressed up against the glass, was Rachel's face. She was smiling. Her blonde hair looked messy, and her eyes were wide, almost unblinking. Her hands were cupped around her face as she tried to peer into the living room. I screamed, and my sister grabbed my arm, pulling me off the couch. We ran to hide behind Dad, who was standing in front of the patio door. Rachel didn't move away. She just stood there, staring at us, and then reached for the door handle. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I whispered to Dad, "Is the door locked?" For a split second, I saw a hesitation on his face, a flicker of doubt. Rachel yanked on the handle, trying to force the door open. She kept jerking it back and forth, pausing every so often to look through the glass, with that same unsettling smile. She looked completely unhinged. Dad stayed calm, though I could tell he was just as scared as we were. He told us to stay behind the wall where we couldn't be seen, and walked toward the door. We begged him not to open it, afraid that she might have a weapon or something. But he cracked the door open just enough to speak to her, keeping a firm grip on the handle. "What the hell are you doing here, Rachel?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She smiled even wider and tried to act sweet. "I just wanted to see you and the kids. I brought Christmas presents." Dad didn't budge. "You need to leave, now. If you don't, I'm calling the cops." At first she tried to argue, pleading with him to let her in, but when she realized he wasn't going to change his mind, her smile faded. She muttered something under her breath, dropped the presents on the patio, and walked away into the darkness. When she was out of sight, Dad stepped outside to make sure she was really gone. He picked up the presents she had left behind and brought them inside, but none of us wanted to open them. Something about it felt wrong, like there was some kind of sinister energy attached to them. They ended up sitting in the trash, still wrapped. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face pressed against the glass, her wild eyes staring into the room. Even now, all these years later, the memory of that night sends shivers down my spine. Rachel eventually faded out of our lives after that, but the fear she left behind didn't go away so easily. To this day, I can't sit with my back to a big window at night. The thought of someone watching from the darkness is too much to bear. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust your gut when someone gives off bad vibes. People like Rachel may seem normal at first, but you never know what they're capable of. It was a freezing winter night in early 2021, the kind where the chill sneaks through the tiniest gaps in the walls, and you can't seem to stay warm no matter how many layers you wear. Outside, the world felt silent, still recovering from the chaos of the COVID lockdowns. Life had slowed to a crawl, and with nowhere to go, I often found myself staring at my computer screen late into the night. At 20 years old, living in the United States, I was just trying to stay sane in a time when everything felt uncertain. I'd always had a passion for making YouTube videos. Even before the pandemic, I loved editing and sharing content, even if my audience was small. It wasn't about fame. It was about creating something I could be proud of and finding a little community to connect with. But life got busy, and I stopped uploading sometime before 2020. Now, with so much time on my hands, that creative itch came back. I decided to give streaming a shot, and in the spring of 2021, I started streaming Minecraft on Twitch. Back then, Minecraft was everywhere. Twitch streamers and YouTubers were raking in views, building giant followings, and creating a buzz I wanted to be part of. I mostly played on Hypixel, diving into mini-games and having fun. Streaming quickly became my escape, a place where I could relax, talk to viewers, and meet new people. It felt good to be doing something I genuinely enjoyed again. It was during this time that I met R. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I think we crossed paths while playing Valorant. He was another small-time streamer, and over time, we started playing games together regularly. I was friendly and easygoing, the kind of person who could make you laugh during a tough match. We started teaming up for streams a couple of nights a week. He never gave me any reason to feel uneasy. If anything, I appreciated having someone reliable to play with. But by late May, my life got busy again. Work picked up, and I had more responsibilities at home. Streaming, while fun, had to take a back seat. I didn't quit all at once. I just started streaming less and less until eventually, I stopped altogether. And I lost touch naturally. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. Our conversations just faded away as I focused on other things. Fast forward to the summer of 2022. Life had settled down a bit, and I found myself reconnecting with old friends from my gaming days. Among them were B and her boyfriend Jay. I had met them both back when I was streaming, and they were a lively duo. B was the classic Valorant e-girl, charismatic, outgoing, and always at the center of attention. She had a big following on TikTok, and was one of those people who seemed to know everyone. Jay was quieter but still friendly, the type of guy who preferred to stay in the background. By this point, Raw had completely slipped my mind. He was just someone I used to game with, nothing more. So when B told me he'd been messaging her about me, I was taken aback. At first, it seemed harmless. He was just asking about me, wondering if I was back online. But then she showed me the messages, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't just casually curious, he was obsessed. His texts came one after another, pleading with her to help him reconnect with me. The things he wrote gave me an uneasy feeling. There was a desperation in his words, like he needed to talk to me, like it was the most important thing in the world. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just lonely, I thought. People were struggling during the pandemic, after all. But his messages didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Within a day, R went from mildly persistent to outright relentless. He spammed B with messages, begging her to give him my information. When she didn't respond, he started calling her repeatedly. The sheer volume of his attempts was overwhelming, hundreds of messages in just a short time. He'd write things like, "Please, I need to talk to her," and "You have to let me get in touch with her." B was freaked out, and so was I. I told her to block him, thinking that would put an end to it. She hesitated at first, worried it might escalate things, but eventually she blocked him. For a moment, I felt relieved. But the peace didn't last. A few days later, R started messaging Jay instead, trying to get to me through him. Around the same time, B and Jay had a massive argument. I wasn't paying much attention to their fight. It felt like typical couple stuff. But then Jay, in his frustration, decided to lash out at me. He blamed me for their fight, and in a moment of anger, gave her all of my information. I didn't find out until it was too late. Suddenly, I was getting spammed on every platform. Friend requests, messages, notifications. It felt like they were coming from everywhere. I had my Discord, my Valorant username, my social media handles. He flooded me with messages, some begging, others rambling about how he needed to talk to me. It was suffocating. Every time I blocked him, he'd create a new account and start again. The worst part was the fear. What if he found out where I lived? What if this obsession turned into something more dangerous? I started shutting down my accounts one by one, disappearing from the online spaces I used to enjoy. Even then, the notifications kept coming. Every time my phone buzzed or my computer chimed, my heart would race. I stopped sleeping properly, constantly on edge. Our messages were unsettling, bouncing between desperate pleas and strange, almost threatening tones. I never responded. Something in my gut told me that acknowledging him would only make things worse. Instead, I tried to fade into the background, hoping he would eventually lose interest. Thankfully he did. After weeks of silence from me, the messages finally stopped. But the experience left a scar. I've always been careful online, but this took things to another level. I started using aliases for everything, refusing to share even the smallest personal detail with anyone. Looking back, I can't help but feel a mix of fear and anger. I wasn't someone I ever considered a close friend, but somehow, he turned into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. His obsession was sudden, intense, and completely unpredictable. It's a reminder that you never truly know someone, even if they seem perfectly normal on the surface. Now every time I log into a game or open Discord, I think about what happened. The fear has faded, but the memory lingers like a shadow. I hope my story serves as a warning to others. Always protect your privacy, and be cautious about who you trust. Sometimes, the people you think are harmless can surprise you in the worst ways. Stay safe out there. Hey everyone, I want to get to know you better. If you've been here since the beginning, leave a comment saying day one, so I can thank you for your support. If you're new, welcome. Let me know by commenting new here. I'm so thankful for all of you. Thanks for being part of the Aftermoon Horrors family. It was the winter of my senior year, and the air outside was biting cold, with the sharp icy wind making my breath visible in the frosty air. I remember it clearly, the chill, the long nights, and the strange events that would soon become the darkest memories of my high school experience. I had just graduated, and the events from a few months ago still echoed in my mind. I never really spoke about it, not to my family or anyone else, because honestly, no one took me seriously. Now, with so much time on my hands, that creative itch came back. I decided to give streaming a shot, and in the spring of 2021, I started streaming Minecraft on Twitch. Back then, Minecraft was everywhere. Twitch streamers and YouTubers were raking in views, building giant followings, and creating a buzz I wanted to be part of. I mostly played on Hypixel, diving into mini-games and having fun. Streaming quickly became my escape, a place where I could relax, talk to viewers, and meet new people. It felt good to be doing something I genuinely enjoyed again. It was during this time that I met R. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I think we crossed paths while playing Valorant. He was another small-time streamer, and over time, we started playing games together regularly. I was friendly and easygoing, the kind of person who could make you laugh during a tough match. We started teaming up for streams a couple of nights a week. He never gave me any reason to feel uneasy. If anything, I appreciated having someone reliable to play with. But by late May, my life got busy again. Work picked up, and I had more responsibilities at home. Streaming, while fun, had to take a back seat. I didn't quit all at once. I just started streaming less and less until eventually, I stopped altogether. And I lost touch naturally. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. Our conversations just faded away as I focused on other things. Fast forward to the summer of 2022. Life had settled down a bit, and I found myself reconnecting with old friends from my gaming days. Among them were B and her boyfriend Jay. I had met them both back when I was streaming, and they were a lively duo. B was the classic Valorant e-girl, charismatic, outgoing, and always at the center of attention. She had a big following on TikTok, and was one of those people who seemed to know everyone. Jay was quieter but still friendly, the type of guy who preferred to stay in the background. By this point, Raw had completely slipped my mind. He was just someone I used to game with, nothing more. So when B told me he'd been messaging her about me, I was taken aback. At first, it seemed harmless. He was just asking about me, wondering if I was back online. But then she showed me the messages, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't just casually curious, he was obsessed. His texts came one after another, pleading with her to help him reconnect with me. The things he wrote gave me an uneasy feeling. There was a desperation in his words, like he needed to talk to me, like it was the most important thing in the world. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just lonely, I thought. People were struggling during the pandemic, after all. But his messages didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Within a day, our went from mildly persistent to outright relentless. He spammed me with messages, begging her to give him my information. When she didn't respond, he started calling her repeatedly. The sheer volume of his attempts was overwhelming, hundreds of messages in just a short time. He'd write things like, "Please, I need to talk to her," and "You have to let me get in touch with her." He was freaked out, and so was I. I told her to block him, thinking that would put an end to it. She hesitated at first, worried it might escalate things, but eventually she blocked him. For a moment, I felt relieved. But the peace didn't last. A few days later, I started messaging Jay instead, trying to get to me through him. Around the same time, B and Jay had a massive argument. I wasn't paying much attention to their fight. It felt like typical couple stuff. But then Jay, in his frustration, decided to lash out at me. He blamed me for their fight, and in a moment of anger, gave her all of my information. I didn't find out until it was too late. Suddenly, I was getting spammed on every platform. Friend requests, messages, notifications. It felt like they were coming from everywhere. I had my Discord, my Valorant username, my social media handles. He flooded me with messages, some begging, others rambling about how he needed to talk to me. It was suffocating. Every time I blocked him, he'd create a new account and start again. The worst part was the fear. What if he found out where I lived? What if this obsession turned into something more dangerous? I started shutting down my accounts one by one, disappearing from the online spaces I used to enjoy. Even then, the notifications kept coming. Every time my phone buzzed or my computer chimed, my heart would race. I stopped sleeping properly, constantly on edge. Our messages were unsettling, bouncing between desperate pleas and strange, almost threatening tones. I never responded. Something in my gut told me that acknowledging him would only make things worse. Instead, I tried to fade into the background, hoping he would eventually lose interest. Thankfully he did. After weeks of silence from me, the messages finally stopped. But the experience left a scar. I've always been careful online, but this took things to another level. I started using aliases for everything, refusing to share even the smallest personal detail with anyone. Looking back, I can't help but feel a mix of fear and anger. I wasn't someone I ever considered a close friend, but somehow, he turned into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. His obsession was sudden, intense, and completely unpredictable. It's a reminder that you never truly know someone, even if they seem perfectly normal on the surface. Now every time I log into a game or open Discord, I think about what happened. The fear has faded, but the memory lingers like a shadow. I hope my story serves as a warning to others. Always protect your privacy, and be cautious about who you trust. Sometimes, the people you think are harmless can surprise you in the worst ways. Stay safe out there. Hey everyone, I want to get to know you better. If you've been here since the beginning, leave a comment saying day one, so I can thank you for your support. If you're new, welcome. Let me know by commenting new here. I'm so thankful for all of you. Thanks for being part of the Aftermoon Horrors family. It was the winter of my senior year, and the air outside was biting cold, with the sharp icy wind making my breath visible in the frosty air. I remember it clearly, the chill, the long nights, and the strange events that would soon become the darkest memories of my high school experience. I had just graduated, and the events from a few months ago still echoed in my mind. I never really spoke about it, not to my family or anyone else, because honestly, no one took me seriously. They dismissed everything as a joke, mostly because they couldn't fathom that something like this could happen to me. Someone who was often overlooked. The ugly child, as they'd put it. The strange events began around a month or two into the school year, during lunch breaks when I would retreat to my math class to escape the loud cafeteria. It wasn't that I hated the noise, but I preferred the quiet, the peace of being left alone to eat or just to think. At first, I didn't notice him. He was just another face in the crowd, someone who'd sit quietly at his desk, maybe passing a glance my way now and then. I thought nothing of it, until one day he started talking to me. I'd been sitting alone, playing games on my phone, when I heard his voice. He had walked over and casually struck up a conversation. We talked about school, life at home, even the strangest topic, what the hood really meant. It wasn't a deep conversation, more like passing time between classes. But when the bell rang and the rest of the class started filing in, we stopped talking, and that was that, or so I thought. After that, we talked a few more times, but nothing too serious, just casual small talk. From my side, I honestly didn't realize he had been flirting with me. It just didn't cross my mind. I was naive to that sort of thing, and I couldn't tell when someone was trying to get my attention in that way. But looking back now, it was clear. There was one day when everything shifted. I was in the class after lunch, eating a snack, when he came back from getting his lunch. He sat down, but then got back up and walked over to my desk. Without a word, he placed a popsicle on the table and said, "I noticed you didn't have one, so I got you one." At that moment, I didn't think much of it. He'd been kind before, so I thanked him, opened it, and ate it. It was a simple gesture, but it felt off, now that I think back on it. Later that day, I overheard some people talking in the hallways. They were gossiping about him, saying he'd been caught playing with himself while watching a video of a girl from our school. I didn't fully register it at the time, still lost in my thoughts about being hungry and just going through the motions of my day. What I did notice, however, was how everyone around me seemed to avoid him after that. But for some reason, he didn't get into trouble for it. After that, he stopped talking to me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had just gotten busy or lost interest. But then things started to get weird. He would stare at me constantly in class during lunch, even in the hallways as I walked to my next class. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the kind of stare that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I'd be talking to my friends or even eating lunch, his eyes would be fixed on me, unblinking. And when I'd catch his stare, he'd just keep watching, with a blank, almost lifeless expression on his face. Whenever my friend noticed him, she'd get protective, glaring back at him or making gestures that told him to leave us alone. It didn't help, though. He'd just look at us, with this expression of pure jealousy, his eyes burning with something dark, and I couldn't understand why. I didn't know why it bothered him so much, but it was hard to ignore. Then, he started talking to me again. He made small comments about my friend, asking why she was so protective of me. When I told him I didn't know, he'd press further. There was something unsettling about how persistent he was. Like he wanted to know more about me, but I didn't realize just how much he already knew. One afternoon, everything came to a head. I was sitting in the classroom, alone during lunch, when I saw him again. This time, he was looking through people's bags. I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I just sat there, pretending not to notice. But I kept track of where he went. Each table he checked, every bag he rummaged through. I tried not to make eye contact, but I couldn't help myself. When he noticed me watching him, he came over. "Oh, my friend borrowed my headphones," he said, trying to explain his actions. But I wasn't convinced. Still, I said nothing, just nodded, and he went on his way. A few minutes later, he grabbed his bag and walked out of the classroom. I thought he was gone, then he turned around and walked back toward me. My heart started racing. I looked up at him, confused, and then, without any warning, he asked for a hug. "Can I have a hug?" he said. I didn't know what to say. I was caught off guard, so I awkwardly agreed. He wrapped his arms around me and pressed his face into my hair. I froze. I didn't know what to do or how to react. I just patted his arm lightly, feeling utterly uncomfortable. After what felt like forever, he pulled away and left. The next day, I was called to the principal's office. I was questioned about what had happened the day before. I told them about the hug, the bags, everything I could remember. Turns out, he'd stolen $200 from someone in the school and had been caught. He was forced to repay the money plus another $50. After that, he never spoke to me again. It wasn't over, though. I didn't know it at the time, but he had started gathering information about me. He became friends with people I had once been close with, and through them, he learned everything he could about me. He knew where I went to school, my favorite fast food places, my favorite drinks, and even my phone number. He knew where I hung out and what games I played. This continued until I graduated, and I thought it was over. I thought I could finally move on with my life, free from the shadow of his obsession. But there were times when my heart would race, and the anxiety would hit me. Every time my brother brought friends over, I'd lock myself in my room, terrified that he'd somehow find his way into my house. Then, I learned something that chilled me to my core. He hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. He had gone to middle school with me, but had been kicked out for inappropriate behavior. And then, he was expelled from his high school before returning to my district. It made sense now, how he had seemed so familiar. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pray to this day that our paths never cross again. His memory lingers, a constant reminder of how vulnerable I was, how easily someone could slip through the cracks of everyday life, and leave a mark that lasts much longer than I ever expected. So Marcus, I hope we never meet again. It was 2016, and I was 17 years old, living in a group home that sat on a busy street in the middle of the city. Despite being surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the urban life, the home had a little backyard with a basketball court, a picnic table, and some grass. The whole backyard was surrounded by a tall, chain-like fence that stood about 2 meters high. On both sides of the house, there were other homes, and at the very back, the fence bordered a public walking and biking path. This path stretched for miles, weaving through a large park, running along the water, and eventually leading all the way to the beach. It was a very popular area, and people from all over came to visit, jog, or just enjoy the view. Now, I wasn't your typical teenager, at least not in the way most people might think. I was pretty put together, despite the fact that I was living in foster care. One of my little habits, something I kept to myself mostly, was that I was a regular cannabis smoker. The workers at the group home knew, but they turned a blind eye to it. As long as I wasn't too obvious about it, they didn't really care. So, on weekends, I would take my morning walks, heading toward the park behind the house. It was my escape. I'd find my favorite park bench, roll up a joint, and just sit there, watching the world go by, enjoying the quiet. But one particular morning, things changed. It was early, maybe around 7 a.m. The air was crisp, a little colder than usual, and there was a stiff wind blowing. I made my usual walk to the park, found my bench, and settled in. The joint lit up with a flicker of the flame, and I took a long, slow drag. The park was quiet, as it usually was at that hour. There was a bit of distance between me and the water, maybe 100 meters or so, and the field between the bench and the waterfront was empty, the grass swaying with the wind. It was then that I noticed something, or rather someone. A man was walking through the field, but he wasn't just strolling. He wasn't walking the paved path, which was the obvious route. No, he was stomping through the tall grass, heading straight for me. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I remember thinking to myself, why is he walking this way? And then, why is he heading straight for me? There was something off about it, and then I noticed what he was holding. It was hard to make out from a distance, but it seemed like something chonky in his hand. My heart rate picked up. Was it a weapon? A bag? I couldn't tell, but all of a sudden everything about that morning felt wrong. The wind was blowing harder now, and it made it harder to keep my joint lit, but it also made me feel more exposed. My mind raced. What do I do? Should I move? Should I stay here? I looked around, trying to see if anyone else was around. To my right, there was an elderly woman, walking from the direction of the group home. She was maybe 20 meters away, but she was walking in the opposite direction. I quickly walked towards her, trying not to look too obvious. As I approached her, I noticed the man was still heading my way, his movements deliberate. I kept walking until I was by her side. Shoo! Look up! The man, who had been getting closer, finally arrived at the park bench where I'd been sitting. The woman was continuing to walk, but I kept my eyes on the man. I couldn't help it. I had to be sure he wasn't following me. But to my surprise, instead of coming straight toward us, the man veered off to the side. He walked behind the bench and laid down in a pile of rocks, as if he had decided to take a break. I glanced over at the woman, who had stopped in her tracks. She looked at me with wide, shocked eyes. I could see she had processed something, and I knew she could sense it too. There was something unsettling about this man, something that made both of us pause. Without saying a word, I turned and walked back the way I came, heading in the opposite direction. I didn't want to be near him any longer than I had to. The elderly woman continued on her way, and I saw her look over her shoulder at the man one last time before disappearing from view. As I walked back to the group home, I tried to calm myself down. Was I overreacting? Maybe. But that feeling, the one in my gut, told me something wasn't right. The day passed without incident, or so I thought. Later that evening, around 9 p.m., something else happened that made me even more uneasy. People in the group home weren't allowed to smoke within 10 meters of any establishment's entry, and our backyard, which had a light above the entry, wasn't much of a place to sneak a smoke. So one of the girls in my group home, let's call her Sarah, decided to go outside to have a cigarette. The backyard was dark, with no real lighting, and I figured she'd be fine. But 3 minutes later, I heard a frantic banging at the door. I rushed over and let her in, Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone's out there," she said, breathless. I saw him. He was standing on the path, just staring at me. I thought maybe he was just walking by, but then he started walking toward me. He was heading straight for the fence, and he was climbing it. I couldn't believe it at first, but then I realized. It was the same man. My heart dropped into my stomach. The feeling of panic from that morning came rushing back. I shared my experience with Sarah, and as I did, it all clicked. This wasn't some random person. This man had been watching us, both of us. We called the workers, and they immediately contacted the police. That night they started patrolling the path more regularly. The group home also added some garden lights in the backyard, and there was a sense of relief that maybe, just maybe, this man wouldn't return. But the truth was, I never fully felt safe after that. The thought of someone watching us, of someone coming that close, lingered in my mind. The cold winter night air, the darkness of the park, the sounds of footsteps in the distance. All of it stayed with me. As time went on, I'd sometimes walk by that park again, but the memories of that day always came back. I'd look over my shoulder, wondering if I might see him again. It was a haunting feeling. I tried not to let it control me, but deep down, I knew that man had left a mark on me that I couldn't shake, and to this day I still think about that strange encounter. I hope for everyone's sake that he never laid hands on anyone else. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. It was a cold September evening in 1996. The kind of evening where the air had a bite to it, hinting at the winter to come. The sky had darkened early, and the streets of Collinsville, Illinois felt quieter than usual. Back then, Collinsville wasn't the bustling town it's grown into today. It was a small, close-capped community, with little more than a few odds and ends scattered along its streets. You wouldn't find it on a map unless you were looking for it. Life moved at a slower pace there, and crime was so rare that even petty theft made the local paper. My parents were living in a modest, two-story apartment building on the edge of town, the kind of building you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Plain brick walls, a small porch, and a narrow staircase that groaned with every step. The building had just 2 units. My parents lived on the ground floor, and a couple occupied the apartment upstairs. At the time, my mom was heavily pregnant with me. I was due in 2 months, and my arrival had become the center of their world. My mom spent her days preparing, folding tiny clothes, and imagining what life would be like when I finally arrived. My dad, on the other hand, worked long hours as a bar manager at a small local spot. Most nights he came home exhausted, his hands smelling of beer and smoke, ready to collapse on the couch. That day had started like any other. My mom decided to visit her parents, wanting to catch up and enjoy a quiet afternoon with them. She bundled herself up against the chill, waddling out the door with the energy only a first-time mom could muster. My dad had just gotten home from his shift and opted to stay behind. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to relax. The first Resident Evil game had just come out on PlayStation, and my dad had been eager to try it out. It was a groundbreaking game, eerie and atmospheric, with tense music that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He settled onto the couch, controller in hand, and immersed himself in the game's unsettling world. The sound of the wind outside rattling the windows only added to the creepy vibe. He had been playing for a while, when something pulled him out of the game. At first he thought it was just his imagination, but then he saw it. A dark, brownish stain creeping down the wall, just above the TV. At first glance he thought it was a water leak. The landlord had mentioned plumbing issues a few days ago, so it wasn't entirely surprising. But as he got closer, something about the stain didn't seem right. The liquid wasn't just brown, it was thick, and had a chunky texture that didn't match water at all. My dad grabbed a tissue and wiped at it. The smell that hit him was sharp and metallic, a scent that made his stomach turn. He stood there for a moment, staring at the stain, his mind racing with possibilities. Feeling uneasy, he called my mom and asked her to come home. She arrived about 20 minutes later, bundled in a heavy coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The moment she saw the stain, her face went pale. She didn't need to touch it or smell it to know. Her voice was low and steady when she said, "That looks like blood." The realization sent a shiver through both of them. The couple upstairs had been fighting the night before. It wasn't unusual. Arguments between them had become so frequent that my parents had learned to tune them out. But now, standing there, staring at the stain, my mom couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. They decided to call the landlord, who arrived within minutes. Together they called the police. As they waited, the minutes dragged on, each one filled with growing dread. The thought that something tragic might have occurred just above their heads was almost too much to process. When the police arrived, their flashing lights cast eerie shadows against the building. My dad couldn't sit still. Despite being told to stay put, he followed the officers and the landlord upstairs, unable to resist the pull of morbid curiosity. The staircase groaned under their weight as they ascended, the air growing colder with each step. When the landlord unlocked the door, the smell hit them first. It was thick and nauseating, a mix of decay and chemicals that clung to the back of their throats. The officer stepped inside first, flashlight in hand, sweeping the dimly lit room. And then they saw it. In the corner of the room, sticking out of a trash can, was what looked unmistakably like a human arm. My dad froze, his breath catching in his throat. The officer quickly pushed him and the landlord out of the room, ordering them to stay back. But it was too late. The image was burned into my dad's mind. Over the next few hours, the horrifying details began to emerge. Earlier that day, the couple upstairs had gotten into one of their usual fights, but this time it escalated. The woman had grabbed a gun and shot her partner 3 times. She claimed it was self-defense, but the position of the bullet wounds told a different story. They had entered his back, suggesting he was turned away when she pulled the trigger. What she did next was beyond comprehension. Instead of calling for help, she dismembered his body. The scene was gruesome, a nightmare come to life. For my parents, the realization was chilling. They had been living beneath this couple for months, completely unaware of how volatile their relationship truly was. The fights they had dismissed as harmless arguments had concealed a darkness that could have easily spilled over into their lives. The woman was arrested and later claimed self-defense in court. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, she was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. The decision left my dad shaking his head in disbelief. Self-defense or not, he would later say, there's no excuse for what she did afterward. For weeks after the incident, my parents couldn't shake the unease. My dad couldn't look at that wall without remembering the stain, the smell, and the sight of that arm in the trash can. My mom, who had been so focused on preparing for my arrival, now carried the weight of knowing how close they had been to danger. Though I wasn't born yet, this story became part of my family's history, retold on cold winter nights when the wind howled outside and the memories felt closer than ever. My parents eventually moved out of that apartment, but the experience stayed with them. Today, Collinsville is a different place. The town has grown, the quiet streets replaced by busy roads and chain stores. But for my parents, that night remains frozen in time, a chilling reminder that sometimes danger is just a thin floor away. It was the middle of winter, one of those cold, quiet nights where the air feels heavy, and the world outside is so still it almost feels unnatural. I remember sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, scrolling through my phone while my husband watched a movie. It felt like any other normal night. We had started the year hoping to try new things, shake things up a little, and maybe have some fun in the process. I'm 28 years old and married to a man I love dearly. We've always been open to trying new ways to keep things exciting. At one point, we joked about the idea of starting an OnlyFans account. The idea of it wasn't serious at first, but the more we talked, the more we thought it could be fun. Why not, we figured. It would be a little side project to bring some extra money in, and maybe spice things up. I wasn't planning on showing too much or being overly risky, and I was careful from the start. I used a nickname, avoided putting in any location or personal details, and didn't even share it with anyone I knew in real life. I figured I was being smart about it. I wasn't big on social media at the time, so getting the hang of everything was a little overwhelming. My parents were always super cautious about internet safety, so I never really got into the whole talking to strangers online thing as a teenager. Growing up, I wasn't allowed to use MySpace or chat rooms like some of my friends, so I didn't have those wild, coming-of-age online experiences that a lot of people talk about. When I signed up for OnlyFans, I realized pretty quickly that I'd need to promote myself to get noticed. That's when I started dipping my toes into Reddit and Twitter. Reddit was confusing to me at first. It's a huge platform, but I found a few smaller subreddits where people were promoting similar pages. I posted a few pictures and shared some harmless fantasies, hoping to grab some attention. I wasn't very active though. I turned off direct messages and only replied to a couple of comments. Some of the comments were rude, and the whole vibe wasn't what I expected. After just a few weeks, I decided it wasn't for me. My OnlyFans wasn't doing much either. I wasn't getting the attention or money I thought I might, so after a couple of months I deleted everything. I shut down my Reddit account, my Twitter, and even the OnlyFans page itself. It wasn't worth the trouble, and honestly, I felt a little relieved to step away from it all. Life moved on, and I didn't think much about it after that. Months went by and things were normal again. I started to forget about my brief time on those platforms. But then one day, I got a text message that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a number with a local area code. The message asked for me by my full first name. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't use my real name on any of those sites. And this was months after I'd deleted everything. Confused and a little uneasy, I replied, asking who it was. The response made my stomach drop. The person introduced himself as R, and said he had followed me on Reddit and subscribed to my OnlyFans. He said, "I've spent so many hours trying to find you. When you deleted your page, it felt like part of me died. I think about you every single day." I froze. How had this person tracked me down? I hadn't given out any personal information, and I wasn't even on those platforms anymore. My hands were shaking as I called my husband and told him what had just happened. He tried to calm me down, telling me to block the number and not to worry. I did as he said and tried to move on. But an hour later, another message came through, this time from a different number. My blood ran cold as I read it. The message listed names: my dad, my uncle, my husband, and a few other people close to me. The sender wrote, "These are the people connected to your number. I'll start messaging all of them until you respond to me. I need to talk to you." I was in full panic mode. I screenshotted the messages and sent them to my husband, who was furious. He's not the type to sit back when someone's harassing me. He immediately called the number and threatened the guy, demanding he leave me alone. But I didn't back down. He replied, "You could just talk to me instead of letting your husband get all mad. We could have fun, and you could make some money." And my mother was left sloppy. By now, I was hysterical. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. I kept wondering how he had found me. Was it someone I knew? A stranger? My husband tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in his face. We thought maybe it was someone I went to school with, but we had no proof. Things got even worse when I sent my husband screenshots of my private Facebook and Instagram accounts. These weren't linked to my OnlyFans or Reddit in any way. Both accounts use a completely different name, and I keep them locked down. Somehow, I had pieced it all together. At this point, my husband tried a new tactic. He told her he had the wrong person, trying to make him doubt himself. But I wouldn't let up. He was convinced he had the right girl, and he kept messaging, saying he wanted to meet us in person. His messages were so casual, like we were just acquaintances making plans to hang out. It was disturbing how normal he acted about it. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the non-emergency line for the police and explained everything to a detective. I was terrified, especially when I admitted to Googling my name and finding my husband's business address. The detective took the report and reached out to R, warning him to leave me alone. Unfortunately, they said there wasn't else they could do unless he made an explicit threat. For a while after that, I lived in constant fear. I deleted every social media account I had and avoided anything that might reveal more about me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, wondering if it was him again. Thankfully, after the detective contacted him, the messages stopped. But the damage was done. The fear and paranoia stayed with me. Looking back, I feel so angry at myself for being careless, even though I thought I was being safe. I never imagined someone could track me down like that. The internet can be a scary place, and it's easy to forget how vulnerable we all are. If my story can serve as a warning to anyone, let it be this. Always be cautious online, protect your privacy at all costs, and never underestimate how far some people will go. To R, if you ever hear this, you're a creep, and I hope you get the help you clearly need. But you will never have control over me again. It was a cold winter night, and the excitement of the anime convention was still buzzing through the air. The hotel was crowded with cosplayers, fans, and people all around, still riding the high of the day's events. I had just finished running a panel, which went well, but I was absolutely exhausted. After a long day of meeting people, answering questions, and sharing my passion for anime, I was more than ready to call it a night. My fiancée and I were staying in a hotel room with two of our male friends, and one other girl who we'll call Jenny. By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, I was done for the day. I had planned to just crash and sleep, but something kept me awake. We'd been out late, chatting with people and taking in the atmosphere, but eventually, the exhaustion hit me, and I decided I'd go to bed early that night. It was around midnight when I finally managed to settle down and relax. Our hotel room was on the floor, with a vending machine right across the hall, which was kind of convenient since I sometimes needed a late-night snack or drink. That night, though, it would turn out to be anything but normal. Jenny came back from the convention's rave around 11 p.m., and as she entered the room, she asked if I wanted a soda. I had cash on me that night for some reason, so I agreed to join her. We both got up and walked out into the hallway toward the machine. It was quiet, and the fluorescent lights flickered slightly as we passed. The hall was empty, and there was a slight chill in the air, even though it was winter. I was barely paying attention as I put my $1.75 into the machine, but I suddenly noticed Jenny going pale. Her face drained of color, and she quickly grabbed my hand. She almost dropped the coins she was holding. My heart started to race. I asked her what was wrong, but she just motioned for us to head back to the room. I looked around, feeling uneasy. That's when I noticed a man walking toward us. He was tall, wearing a convention t-shirt, but something about him just didn't sit right. He walked directly up to us and asked if we were attending the convention. I remember the question sounding odd at the time. I looked at Jenny, still holding her hand, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. I casually replied, "I left my badge in the room." The man didn't seem to care. Instead, he turned his attention to Jenny. The way he looked at her sent chills down my spine. He then gave us a strange smile, and for a brief moment, I noticed his eyes flicker down to her cosplay. Jenny's costume was from a series called Hack Sign, and I had seen her wear it before at conventions. The man's interest in her outfit was unmistakable, and that made me more suspicious. I was trying to keep it cool, but my senses were on high alert. Something wasn't right. He introduced himself as doing a security check. Now that was the moment I really started to get concerned. Security checks during conventions were always done on the main floor, not in the hotel hallways. They certainly didn't happen outside rooms. My instincts kicked in. I quickly scanned him over, looking for any identification or equipment, like a badge or a walkie-talkie, but he hadn't either. It was only then that I fully realized something was off. Convention security had badges that clearly identified them as staff, and they were always in uniform. This man, though, had none of those things. He didn't even have the standard walkie-talkie most security personnel carried. My heart started pounding faster. I had a bad feeling about this guy. At that moment, Jenny squeezed my hand tighter. I could feel her fear. Without thinking, I turned to the man and demanded to see the security director. I was practically yelling by then, but I was doing it for a reason. I didn't know who this guy was or what his intentions were, but I wasn't about to let him get any closer. He stepped back, clearly caught off guard. He glanced behind him, and I saw his eyes dart nervously down the hallway. Just then, I noticed a few people coming out of the elevators, and the man's expression changed. His gaze flickered toward the stairs, and without saying a word, he turned and sprinted down the hall. It all happened so quickly. Jenny looked at me, thanking me in a whispered voice, still shaken up by what had just transpired. I couldn't understand what was going on. Why had this man been so interested in Jenny? Who was he, and what was he really up to? My first thought was that maybe he was just some strange person, lost or confused. But something told me this wasn't a random encounter. We headed back to our room, and as we walked, I felt a rush of adrenaline slowly fade, but I couldn't shake the unease. Once inside the room, I closed the door behind us. It wasn't until later that the full extent of what had happened began to come out. The Real Convention security arrived soon after. Jenny's boyfriend was also there, and he wanted to know everything that had happened. That's when Jenny shared the rest of the story with us. Apparently, the man wasn't just some random stranger. He was someone who had been following her for months. He had become obsessed with her cosplay from Hack Sign. He had watched her online, kept track of her appearances at conventions, and started showing up at events where she'd be. What was even worse was that Jenny had never told anyone about this. She didn't want to worry her boyfriend or friends, thinking she could handle it all by herself. But the truth was she couldn't handle it, and that night it had gotten worse. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't confronted him, who knows what would have happened. Jenny thanked me again, and while I was relieved nothing serious happened, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. Later on, I found out that the man had been known to convention staff. He had a history of stalking cosplayers, particularly ones he admired from his favorite series. This wasn't the first time he had shown up at a convention uninvited, and this wasn't the first time he had caused trouble. But the fact that he had gotten so close to Jenny, that he had been so focused on her without anyone noticing until it was almost too late, was chilling. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't stepped in, but every time I recall that night, The way he approached us, the cold air in the hallway, the way he vanished down the stairs. I can't help but feel a bit of fear creeping back in. The thought that someone could be so obsessed with another person, to the point of stalking them at a convention, was enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. So now, every time I go to another convention, I think back to that night. I think about Jenny, and how lucky we were that everything turned out okay. I also think about that man. I don't want to see him again, and I hope we never cross paths, but in the back of my mind, there's always that little bit of worry. The world can be a strange and sometimes dangerous place, and not everyone at a convention is there to enjoy the fun. Some people have darker intentions. It was the winter of 1988, and like every other New Year's Eve, my college friends and I had our usual tradition, heading up into the hills of a nearby state park to watch the fireworks show. The park overlooked our small college town, and while many people stayed in the town center, crowded around with the campus cops to watch the fireworks from a distance, we preferred to go up into the hills, away from all the noise and distractions. We'd sneak away with a few beers, some smokes, and the perfect view of the fireworks, where we could hang out and have a good time without worrying about getting in trouble. That year, we decided to do something a little different. Instead of just watching the fireworks and heading home, we made the decision to camp out. We figured it was the perfect opportunity to drink ourselves silly and not worry about finding a ride home, since we didn't need one. So, after the fireworks ended and the night was still young, we found a spot by the overlook to pitch our tents. We all had a few beers, told some stories, laughed a lot, and partied until we could hardly stand up anymore. By the time it was 3 or 4 in the morning, most of us were pretty blackout drunk. The night had gone well, and we all had a great time. Eventually, though, sleep began to take over, and we all climbed into our sleeping bags to try to get some rest before the sun came up. The sound of the woods around us and the cold air made it hard to fall asleep right away, but exhaustion took over, and before long, I was out cold. I woke up the next morning in a haze, still half drunk and groggy. My head was throbbing, and the hangover hadn't quite hit yet. I knew it was coming, but for the moment, I was still drunk enough to feel okay, though that didn't last long. What I felt next wasn't so easy to ignore. A desperate need to use the bathroom. I needed to pee, but more than that, I had to go number 2. The urgency was real, and it felt like I was about to burst. I put my boots on and crawled out of my tent, trying not to wake anyone. The air was cool, and I quickly looked around for a place to relieve myself. I didn't want to just squat anywhere. I needed some privacy, and I needed something sturdy to lean against because I wasn't just peeing. I was going to drop the kids off at the pool. I didn't walk too far. Maybe 100 yards into the woods, I found a spot that seemed perfect. A thick tree trunk to lean against, some thick bushes around to keep things private. The ground was soft but firm enough to keep me steady. I pulled down my pants, and that's when I started doing my business, making sure to keep an eye out. We were college kids, after all, and we had a Polaroid camera on hand back then. I didn't want anyone sneaking up on me, snapping pictures, and making a joke of it. It was a silly fear, but it was real. The thought of someone catching me in such an embarrassing moment made me on edge. I kept my head turned to the horizon, scanning the woods. That's when I felt it, a light, tickling sensation on my left leg. I thought it was just a branch brushing against me at first, but when I looked down, my stomach dropped. A huge centipede was crawling up my leg, making its way from the ground to my pants. It was no ordinary centipede either. I'd seen the blue centipedes that are native to Alabama before. Those were big but harmless. This one, however, was brown with yellow legs and the size of a small ruler. Its head was enormous, and the fangs were terrifying. I knew instantly that this was an invasive species. It had come up from the tropics, and its bite was not only painful but potentially dangerous. I froze. The centipede was moving quickly, and it was climbing up my leg. It was heading for a place on me that I absolutely did not want it to go. I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to smack it off, but I knew that would risk it biting me. If I moved, it might sink its teeth into my skin. On the other hand, if I stayed still, there was a chance it might crawl back down or even move off onto my pants, where I could swipe at it without risking a bite. But it was already past my knee, heading toward my upper thigh. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and the more I stared at the centipede, the darker my vision became around the edges. I thought I was going to pass out. Every time I breathed in, I felt the pressure building in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was stuck, praying that this thing wouldn't crawl to where I feared it was headed. It got worse as the centipede crawled higher. The reality of the situation hit me. This was not just some weird bug moment. This was potentially a dangerous situation. I was exposed, vulnerable, and completely at the mercy of whatever this creature decided to do. As it made its way further up my leg, over my groin, I thought I might faint. I remember thinking that if I moved, I could fall off the log. Falling backward would mean I'd land in my own mess, but falling forward would bring me face to face with the creature. I honestly think I stopped breathing for a few seconds. It was the longest few moments of my life. I was still as a statue, trying not to make a sound, hoping and praying that this bug wouldn't decide to crawl into places that could cause me unimaginable pain. Every part of me screamed to move, to get up, to do something, but I stayed still, knowing that doing anything might make the situation worse. Finally, after what seemed like eternity, the centipede started moving away from me, creeping down my other leg. It continued down to the ground, without ever once making a detour. I watched, barely able to believe what had just happened. I didn't move a muscle until I could confirm that the bug was gone. Once it was safely on the ground, I felt like I could finally breathe again, but I didn't move right away. I had to process what had just happened. After a minute or two of stillness, I finally wiped myself, pulled my pants up, and walked back to the campsite. I was shaken to the core, my heart still pounding, my legs like jelly. I'm sure I looked as pale as a ghost when I walked back into camp. The guys who were awake immediately noticed something was wrong. They could tell by my face that I was freaked out. There were a couple of beers left over from the night before, so I drank them both in quick succession, trying to calm myself down. One of the guys started laughing when I told them what had happened, but it was a nervous laugh at first. As I explained how close I had come to a disaster, their laughter turned into genuine concern. They kept saying it was just a bug, but I think everyone knew if it had been any of them in my place, they would have been just as terrified. The experience stuck with me for a long time. Weeks passed, and I couldn't sit down on anything without checking it first. I had developed a strange habit of thoroughly inspecting anything I was about to sit on, especially in places with minimal furniture. Even now, decades later, the mention of centipedes still makes my skin crawl. I can't help but picture that moment, when the creature was crawling up my leg, getting closer to places I never wanted it to go. I'm sure this story might sound tame to some, especially to anyone who isn't as squeamish as I've become. But let me tell you, at that moment, it felt like the most terrifying experience of my entire life. It's not just about the bug, it was the sheer vulnerability of the situation, knowing that I had no way out. Even today, I'll think about it and shudder. It was an experience I'll never forget. The worst thing I ever witnessed as a mortician happened years ago, while I was working trauma nights and general surgery. I'd seen my fair share of horrifying, tragic, and bizarre situations in my career, but nothing had ever prepared me for what unfolded that New Year's Eve. It started off like most trauma nights, busy and chaotic. New Year's Eve always brought in its share of accidents and injuries. People would drink too much, get into fights, or drive recklessly. Sometimes we'd see victims of fireworks or other holiday-related mishaps. But that night, just past midnight, we received a call about a teenage boy being rushed into the trauma bay. He'd been shot, not once or twice, but 9 times. Apparently what had happened was some celebratory gunfire had gone terribly wrong. You know how people sometimes shoot into the air at midnight to celebrate the new year? Well, someone wasn't paying attention to what they were doing, and this poor kid got caught in the crossfire. The details were still a little hazy when he arrived, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was that we had to try and save him. When the ambulance rolled in, the trauma bay lit up with action. Doctors, nurses, and techs were all moving fast, doing everything they could to stabilize him. I've seen plenty of gunshot victims in my time, but this kid, he was in bad shape. He was barely hanging on when they brought him in, his body riddled with bullet wounds, bleeding out faster than we could keep up. It was clear that the odds were stacked against him, but nobody was willing to give up. Not yet. We ran the code. That's what we call it when we do everything in our power to revive a patient. Chest compressions, medications, blood transfusions, intubation. You name. We did it. At one point, the surgeon made the call to perform a thoracotomy. For those who don't know, a thoracotomy is when the chest is opened up so the doctor can access the heart directly. It's a last-ditch effort, something you only do when there's nothing else left to try. The surgeon worked quickly, his hands covered in blood, as he tried to massage the kid's heart back to life. But despite everyone's best efforts, the boy flatlined. We couldn't bring him back. After the code was called and the time of death was pronounced, there was a heavy silence in the room. Everyone looked tired, defeated. Losing a patient is never easy, no matter how many times you've experienced it. But losing someone so young, that hits differently. The doctors and nurses quietly filed out of the trauma bay, leaving me and the janitorial staff to handle the aftermath. My job at that point was to clean up the patient, document everything, and prepare the body for the morgue. As I sat outside the trauma bay, writing my notes, I could hear the janitorial staff inside cleaning up. Blood and debris were everywhere. It had been a brutal, chaotic scene. They were scrubbing the floors and disposing of everything that had been used during the code. It was around this time, a full 9 minutes after we'd called the time of death, that the most chilling thing I've ever experienced happened. Out of nowhere, the boy's body sat up. I'm not talking about a little twitch or spasm. I mean, he sat up. A full sit-up, right there on the table, still covered by the tarp we'd placed over him. And then, as if that wasn't horrifying enough, he let out this loud, guttural groan. A sound that didn't even seem human. It was deep and raspy, like something out of a horror movie. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. It was like my brain just froze, unable to process what I was seeing and hearing. I called the janitorial staff. They lost it. One of them screamed so loud it probably woke up half the hospital. Another one. The third just straight up passed out, collapsing right there on the floor. I can't even blame them. I've seen some wild things in my line of work, but that was on a whole other level. Hearing the commotion, the doctors and nurses who had been in the trauma bay earlier came running back in. For a moment, it was like the code had started all over again. They pulled the tarp off, checked for signs of life, and even restarted chest compressions. Someone called out that they were getting pulseless electrical activity, PA we call it, which is when the heart shows electrical activity, but isn't actually pumping blood. It's not a good sign, but it's better than nothing. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we'd get him back. But no. Despite the second round of efforts, the story ended the way it did. He flatlined again, and this time it was final. The doctors called it, and everyone slowly stepped back, looking as shaken as I felt. Afterwards, there were a lot of theories floating around about what had happened. Some people said it was the Lazarus phenomenon, which is when a person's heart starts beating again after CPR has stopped. It's extremely rare, but not entirely unheard of. Others thought it might have been a spontaneous diaphragmatic spasm. Basically, a sudden contraction of the muscles that control breathing. That could explain the groan, at least. One doctor mentioned something about residual nerve activity, but he admitted he'd need to see it happen again to really understand it. Whatever the explanation was, it didn't change the fact that it scared the life out of me. I've dealt with plenty of dead bodies in my career, and I've seen my fair share of post-mortem phenomena. Bodies can twitch, jerk, even make noises sometimes. It's all part of the natural process as muscles relax and gases escape. But this was on a whole different level. It was like something out of a nightmare. Later that night, after the boy's body had been sent to the morgue and the trauma bay had been cleaned up, I sat in the break room, trying to process what had happened. The janitorial staff were still shaken, and I heard one of them muttering about how they'd never set foot in the trauma bay again. The nurses and doctors, meanwhile, seemed to brush it off as just another strange medical anomaly. For them, it was just part of the job. But for me, it's something I'll never forget. The saddest part of all this is that the boy's death could have been avoided. If people had just been more responsible. If they hadn't been firing guns into the air like it was some kind of celebration. He'd still be alive. He had his whole life ahead of him, and it was taken away in an instant because of someone else's stupidity. To this day, that night remains the creepiest and saddest moment of my career. I've seen a lot of things as a mortician, but nothing has ever come close to the sheer horror of watching a dead body sit up and groan. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, no matter how much time passes. And while I've had other strange experiences since then, none of them have ever topped what happened that New Year's Eve. I've always had great memories of Christmas growing up. Most years, the holiday was nothing but joy, laughter, and the kind of warm happiness you'd expect. But there's one Christmas that sticks out in my mind for all the wrong reasons. It's not one I like to talk about often, but every so often it comes back to me clear as day. What makes it worse is that, even now, I don't know who was responsible for what happened. My family has our theories, and they seem logical enough, but deep down there's still no real answer. This all happened when I was 15 years old, back in the late 80s. It was one of those winters where the snow came down thick and heavy early in December. By the time Christmas rolled around, the world outside looked like a picture-perfect postcard. The fields and streets were blanketed in white, and the trees were covered in a sparkling layer of frost. I've always loved snow. Something about it made everything feel peaceful and safe. That year, though, it felt like the snow was hiding something, like it wasn't just the ground that was being covered up. Christmas vacation started about a week before the big day. Unlike my kids, who only ever seemed to get 2 or 3 days off before Christmas, we had a full week to enjoy. I spent most of my time sleeping in, playing video games, and just being a lazy teenager. Back then, I had an Atari, and even though it's laughably outdated by today's standards, it was my pride and joy. Those first few days of vacation were completely normal. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, and I didn't feel anything unusual. On Christmas Eve, the house was cozy, and the smell of cookies baking in the oven filled the air. My brothers and I stayed up late watching TV together, the glow of the tree lights reflecting off the snow-covered windows. By the time I climbed into bed, it was after midnight. The air outside was biting cold, but my room was warm and safe. I've always been a deep sleeper, even as a kid. Once I'm out, I'm out. Nothing short of an earthquake could wake me. That Christmas Eve was no different. I fell asleep quickly, excited for what the morning would bring. When I woke up, it was Christmas morning. The sun streamed through my window, bouncing off the snow outside, making my room look brighter than usual. I could hear the faint sounds of my brothers downstairs, already up and waiting to tear into their presents. The house smelled of pancakes and bacon as I made my way to the kitchen, where my parents had been up for a while preparing breakfast. We ate together, laughing and talking about the day ahead. It felt perfect, just like Christmas should. After breakfast, we gathered around the tree. The living room was warm, lit by the glow of the tree lights and the soft morning sun reflecting off the snow. One by one, we started opening presents. It was the usual chaos of wrapping paper flying everywhere, laughter, and plenty of thank yous. I got some great gifts that year, a few games for my Atari, some clothes I actually liked, and a couple of other things I'd been hoping for. For a while, everything felt perfect. It was late morning when I noticed a small present still under the tree. It was the size of a box of playing cards, maybe a little bigger, and it was wrapped in paper I didn't recognize. Most of our gifts had been wrapped in cheerful holiday paper covered in Santas or reindeer, but this one was different. The paper was plain and dull, almost like it didn't belong. I picked it up and looked at the tag. My name was on it, but it didn't say who it was from. I sat down on the couch with the box in my lap. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I remember my brothers joking, telling me to hurry up and open it, but for some reason I hesitated. Finally, I unwrapped it. Inside was a plain square box with a lid. I took off the lid, and that's when I saw them. Polaroid photos. At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe it was a silly gift from one of my brothers, but as I pulled the photos out and started flipping through them, I felt my stomach drop. My hands started shaking. Each photo was a picture of me, taken while I was asleep in my bed. The photos were clear, even though they must have been taken in the dark. The flash had gone off in every shot, lighting up my face and the room around me. There were 8 photos in total, and in each one, I was sound asleep, completely unaware. What made it worse was that someone had scratched out the eyes on every single picture. Not just scratched them, gouged them out so violently that some of the photos were torn. My dad must have noticed the look on my face because he came over and asked what was wrong. I couldn't speak. I just handed him the pictures. He went quiet as he looked through them, his expression hardening with each one. Finally, he turned to my brothers and demanded to know if one of them was behind it. "Where did you get a Polaroid camera?" He asked them angrily. Was this some kind of joke? Because it's not funny. My brothers both denied it immediately. They looked just as confused and creeped out as I felt. Dad didn't believe them at first. He said if they'd borrowed a camera from a friend or planned this as a prank, now was the time to confess, but they kept denying it. My dad even threatened to ground them for the rest of Christmas break, but they still insisted they had nothing to do with it, and I believed them. There was something about the whole thing that felt too strange, too wrong to be one of their pranks. We didn't own a Polaroid camera. None of our friends or neighbors did either, as far as we knew. And besides, how could someone have gotten into my room to take those pictures? We hadn't been robbed. There was no sign of a break-in anywhere in the house. Nothing was missing or disturbed. It was like whoever took the photos had come and gone without leaving a single trace. My dad eventually called the police. They came and took a report, but it was obvious they didn't take it seriously. They probably thought it was just a dumb prank by one of my brothers or a friend. They didn't find anything, and after a while, the investigation, if you can even call it that, was dropped. For a few days after that, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone standing in my room, camera in hand, watching me in the dark. I started checking the locks on every door and window in the house before going to bed, but it didn't help. I felt like someone was watching me. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind outside, it all felt like something more sinister. I even tried sleeping with the light on, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Eventually, though, life went back to normal. Nothing else happened, and as the weeks turned into months, I started to feel safe again. My brothers never admitted to anything, and as time went on, I became more and more convinced they were telling the truth. To this day, they still swear it wasn't them. Even now, almost 40 years later, they insist they had nothing to do with it. I never found out who left that box under the tree or why they did it. My family and I have talked about it over the years, but we've never come up with a solid explanation. Maybe it was just a prank, like the police said. But if it wasn't funny. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, buried in the back of your mind. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those pictures, and I wonder if, somewhere out there, someone still has the negatives. And if they do, I wonder what else they might have done. It was the night before Christmas, just a few years ago. My sister and I were in her room, sorting through clothes since we shared a closet. The air was heavy with the scent of peppermint-scented candles, and the soft hum of a Christmas playlist played in the background. I was hanging up a shirt when I suddenly heard a loud noise, like the toilet lid had slammed shut in the bathroom. The sound was sharp and unexpected, and it startled me. I froze, holding the hanger midair, and exchanged a look with my sister, who seemed just as confused. Determined to figure out what had caused the sound, I walked cautiously toward the bathroom. When I got there, the toilet lid was indeed down. I knew I hadn't left it that way, and we were the only ones in the house. My parents were out visiting friends, and it was just the two of us. "Hey," I called out down the hall, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you leave the toilet lid down?" My sister yelled back, "No, I haven't even been in there." I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed lid and trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe she had forgotten, or maybe it was just some odd coincidence. A shift in the house, a breeze, or something like that. But deep down it felt off. I've always believed in the paranormal, and something about this gave me chills that I couldn't shake. Still, I pushed the thought aside and went back to my sister's room. As I was walking down the hallway, I glanced over toward my bedroom. That's when the light in my room flickered, and then shut off completely. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze mid-step, staring into the dimly lit hallway. The next thing I knew, there was a loud crash coming from the kitchen. It was so sudden, and so loud that my sister came running out of her room, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know. Let's check it out," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. We cautiously made our way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under our feet. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move as if it had a life of its own. When we got there, everything was in its place. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. It didn't make sense. My sister tried to laugh it off, nervously joking that it was probably just the Christmas ghost messing with us. But I could tell she didn't really believe that. Neither did I. We went back to her room, trying to shake off the uneasiness that clung to us like cobwebs. As we walked, I kept my eyes down, focused on the floor. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow moved across the doorway to my room. It wasn't a trick of the light. I'm certain of that. It moved with purpose, like someone walking by, my breath caught in my throat. I let out a small squeal, more out of surprise than anything else, and my sister turned to look at me. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that?" I said, pointing toward the doorway. She shook her head, but the look on her face told me she was getting even more freaked out. We hurried back to her room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Then we called our parents. They had gone out for the evening, and were about 15 miles away in the next county. It took a few tries, but we finally got through to them. We told them what had happened, and they promised they'd head back as soon as they could. Those 40 minutes we spent waiting for them were some of the longest of my life. We stayed in her room, huddled together on the bed, jumping at every little sound. The sound of the wind rattling the windows made us flinch, and every creak of the floorboards set our nerves on edge. Luckily, nothing else happened that night. But that wasn't the end of it. For the rest of the Christmas break, strange things kept happening. Every night, I struggled to sleep. I kept the light on and the door open, but it didn't help. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a heavy, oppressive feeling, like someone was standing right behind me, just out of sight. One night the feeling was so strong that I stayed up, sitting on my bed with my back against the wall. My mom and aunt were across the hall in my mom's room talking. I could hear their voices, but they didn't make me feel any safer. Suddenly, I heard soft footsteps in my room. It was unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare turn around. I stayed as still as I could, hoping I was imagining it. But then I felt something jump onto the bed. The mattress shifted under the weight, and the whole bed started to shake. I was too scared to scream. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for it to stop, and just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The next morning, I told my mom about it, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just a bad dream. I wanted to believe her, but I knew what I had felt. It was real. The worst part of the break happened a few nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no apparent reason. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what had startled me. That's when I saw him. There was a man sitting on the edge of my sofa, just a few feet away from my bed. He was leaning back, one leg crossed over the other, his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me. He was wearing a dark suit, and his skin was pitch black. His hair was shoulder-length and braided, with small red beads at the ends of each braid. His hands were clasped together, and he didn't move. I couldn't look away. It wasn't just that I saw him. He saw me too. All their eyes met, and there was this horrible, undeniable connection. He wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. He was real, and he was watching me. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at him, too scared to breathe. Finally, I looked away, hoping he'd be gone when I looked back. But when I turned my head again, he was still there. It wasn't until I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10 that he finally disappeared. After that, I refused to sleep in the dark. I kept the lights on every night for weeks. I never saw him again, but the paranoia stayed with me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was in the apartment with me. I'd hear soft footsteps in the hallway, the sound of nails clicking on the floor, like an animal was walking around. One night, I worked up the courage to check it out. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway, but the moment I did, the footsteps stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as I turned to go back to my room, the footsteps started again, this time coming straight toward me. I slammed the door shut and didn't leave my room for the rest of the night. The final straw came when I started waking up to find my bed made. I'm not the kind of person who makes my bed ever, but one day, I came home to find the blankets perfectly smoothed out, the pillows fluffed and arranged neatly. I was alone in the house, and no one had been there while I was out. It happened 2 more times after that. Once I left the room for just a few minutes, and when I came back, the bed was made. Another time, my blanket had been crumpled into a ball at the foot of the bed, and a book one had been reading was tucked under the covers. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the house. It wasn't until I talked to one of my neighbors that I learned the truth. The previous tenant, an old man, had died in the apartment just a month before I moved in. That explained a lot, but it didn't make me feel any better. The activity eventually died down, and nothing major has happened since then. But I still feel uneasy in the apartment. I'm counting down the days until I can move out and leave this all behind.